and then somebody should just like take some brief notes or something of what the subcommittees did. And I'll just mention now, we'll have to figure out, or each individual subcommittee will have to figure out how frequently they want to meet, what they want to do. I mean, if we want to stay with this format and just have the subcommittees meet for a half hour next time, we can do that. But sooner or later, we're going to have, we're going to have a draft or some rough outline of the long-range plan that we'll be working with. So we'll have to figure out how much discussion we're going to be doing here in the subcommittees, and I think, I don't know, our schedules may have to fluctuate a little bit. So that was my only thought. So, and the other thing is that Matthews had offered, he had room for another 5 people to take on a tour of his facility at 1:30 today of the SWAG members. And I had offered that in my email. I didn't hear back from anybody, so I think Matt's feelings won't be too hurt if nobody else goes, but I don't, whatever.
3 or 100 doesn't matter to me.
And, so you can let me know. Anyway. Hi, Eric. Was there anybody else down there? Or?
Well, there's other people, but I'm not sure they're coming here.
Whether they're coming here. They don't want to join our party. I don't know. I don't have a sense of who's coming and who isn't.
I know Greg Leahy said he wasn't going to be able to come. I didn't hear anything from Steve. I'm trying to think who else isn't here right now.
No.
Raise your hand if you weren't here.
Yeah. I mean, the other problem is if people were confused about that 9:30 thing.
Yeah, because a reminder came up and said it was 9:30.
I know.
Yeah.
Just to keep us on our toes.
Well, I mean, Mike, you can explain that. There's a calendaring system, right? And it sends out automatic notices, and it didn't adjust with us, right? So we were hoping everybody knew that it was 9 o'clock.
Is there a way to fix that going forward? Next time around?
Well, yeah, I guess if the group decides that they want us to meet at 9 a.m. going forward, we can make that change. But the thing is, that system is set up for all future meetings. So if we make a change for one meeting, it changes all meetings.
There's no way to just do it individually? Or it's a pain?
There may be, but
Is this thing go to?
yeah.
We'll figure it out. Well, thank you for sharing.
The target keeps changing, so we're trying to keep up with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do you want to just start? All right. Okay, guys, so why don't we go ahead and break up into our subcommittees, and as people come, I'll just tell them to go to their rooms.
Go to your room. You said you had a list of all the different?
Yeah, so just to remind people, so the waste reduction one was Frida, Mark, Steve Podgy, and Greg Leahy. So that's just the 2 of you. And I can't quite.
213C.
213C.
I can help
Yeah.
get folks to where they
Okay,
sit.
there's Steve.
Way to make an entrance, Steve.
Perfect time.
Yeah. So that's 213C. And then recycling and composting is this room. That's Reagan, Ben, Adam, Brian, and Lynn, who's going to be joining remotely.
And she is here.
And she's here. And then the alternative waste management tech is Matt, Duncan, Eric, James, Howard, and Colin. And that's 214C. So for the people that just came, I was just saying that somebody should be responsible within the subcommittee to report what happened within the subcommittee when we reconvene at 10:30, and somebody should just take some brief notes or something so that we have a record of what's happening in in the subcommittee meetings. The subcommittee meetings are in person only, they're not live streamed, because the tech was just complicated to do all of that. But of course, when we come back again at 10:30, our regular meeting will be live streamed. And we'll talk for a bit about the subcommittees. I've asked Mark if he would just do a sort of landfills overview. And I know a lot of you know a lot about landfills, but this is part of my effort to just sort of get us all up to kind of the same playing field, and also because the public does listen a lot to what we're doing, I'm trying to also use this as an opportunity to help educate those who are interested in what we're doing. So I guess that's it, and Howard's gonna update us on legislative stuff, and we'll figure out. I mean, our group was on the news again this morning as I was going on, so a lot of people have really high hopes. So we have to, we've got to, I hope, live up to a lot of it. And I guess that's it. So if you guys want to take people, I mean, part of the group is just staying here, so it's just two groups that are going to different rooms.
Yeah, if you're in the waste reduction or alternate technologies subcommittee, we're gonna go out this door. I'll lead you guys to the other conference rooms.
See you at 10:30.
Is everybody?
No, there's Howard.
Oh.
Is in the restroom. He should be right back.
Get everything done while I was
All right,
Yeah, you got a long list that you have to do.
Yeah, you got all the
same.
you got all
Or
the
my
tasks.
elected president.
Exactly, we voted you.
The last guy in the room.
Chair, scribe, everything.
Yep.
Should we introduce ourselves just so we know who everybody is?
Matt Hughes.
Howard Pearl.
Duncan Watson.
Jamal, UNH.
Eric Steinhauser, the Sanborn Head, and Valley Waste Management Council.
John Tuthill.
I'm sorry, what was
John Tuthill, T-U-T-H-I-L-L. So you volunteered to take notes this time?
No, I just.
Well, you were the only one writing,
I
so.
was gonna say it's.
It looked like you were volunteering.
I've learned not to volunteer very much. I think I put on things like this.
I understand that.
Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I chose this committee because it sort of felt like the hybrid of some of the other things that were out there. But fundamental to sort of my own personal agenda is you know, recycling is going to be fundamental to this process with alternative technologies, but I only mean alternative technologies in the sense that, you know, they're not widely employed at this time in this country, and that's what I think should be happening to achieve the goals of the hierarchy. recycling sorting system where literally we were bending over, picking up an individual item, looking at what it was, and then putting it in its Gaylord container, and somehow that was, that was what we were doing, to recycle. But because we couldn't keep up with the volume every single day, at the end of the day, the loader would come in, scoop up a bucket of recycling, bring it up to the landfill, and dump it, because we just couldn't keep up with the volume of it. And it was probably a year and a half later after I started in Keene, so early 90s, that we built a materials recovery facility and started the process of more efficiently sorting. Now, I will say that it was a pretty big jump going from a 2-car garage with Gaylord containers and stooping down and picking stuff up to a mechanized system, actual sorting system. But I would say that we went from no wheel to a wooden wheel, and we're staying. I'm at the wooden wheel stage still, and we're trying to drive a Ferrari with wooden wheels on it, and it's just not working very well. And I don't think that we need to invent a new wheel specifically. I think there are wheels out there that can help us, but it's getting people to understand that there are technologies available out there. They're in use in European countries. There is a beta facility out in California that's achieving some much higher diversion with a mixed waste stream, and that possibility does exist, but it's going to take a tremendous amount of willpower to get people off of their own agendas to see that there's another possibility out there.
So what is your big limiting factor for you? Is it funding or regulatory issues or some of both?
Well, so the technologies that exist out there right now are ones that just haven't been strung together in the way that we're talking about. I mean, what we're talking about is a materials recovery facility on steroids.
Gotcha.
Right now we do 8 to 10 sortations in my own facility. A MRF of that I envision would be a MRF that would have 50 plus sortations in it, and using technology mostly and human systems. It has the ability to literally take the whole waste stream. I mean, part of the issues that have been involved in waste management in general is that recycling collection aspects of it, which is where the real expenses are, to collect material, is grossly inefficient. In many places, like in Keene, for instance, there is a private network of collectors that that you could literally have 5 or 6 different haulers going down the same exact street, collecting both waste and recycling, because it's a privatized system. And we've even gone in there and said, hey, the city could do this not only cheaper, but better. And people just don't. It's a political football that nobody wants to have at. So I think the limiting factor is that this new type of technology, that would be required to address this system. Number one, there's I don't think there's any getting around the fact that landfilling is going to be part of a future. I don't think there's any doubt that waste energy is probably going to be part of the future for fractions of the waste stream. But from a hierarchical standpoint, what I'm envisioning is much more in line with the way that the hierarchy is structured, so that we're back in balance. And so we're talking about diverting 80+% of the waste stream and landfilling and or waste energy the remainder fraction of that. But the limiting factor is
one of the problems is the markets, right? When you separate 80%, what do you do with it?
Right. Well, see, this is part of this new sort of it's sort of like the modern city, as it were. That when you start to dreamscape what it would look like. So part of the problem with markets, as you say, is that we have disconnected markets. Sometimes these markets are at a very long distance from where the material might be processed, and then transporting that material. I've always told people that why is this thing not recyclable? Well, everything is technically recyclable, but you need a certain critical mass to make recycling work, whether it's the processing facility itself or the storage facility to handle the material, and then accumulating enough of that one material to send to a facility that needs that material as their raw material for a new product. And MRFs on steroids, you know, are much bigger than a municipal facility. I mean, you know, the city of Keene cannot do this by itself, and it doesn't matter what I dream, what I want. You know, without a bigger system in play, I will just keep, you know, tilting at windmills. So I think that, you know, my vision, and Eric, you know, is familiar with this from being on the Waste Management Council. I had, you know, a guest speaker come into the Waste Management Council to, you know, address this very issue. That guest speaker happened to be my brother, which, you know, sort of creates an odd place for me to be. But, you know, my brother has you know, the right chops, that I think that he has the right credibility to, you know, be a front person for this. And having been in the business for as long as I have, I don't see why it couldn't work. But, you know, to answer your question, I think that the big problem is that, you know, there's a lot of people who just can't envision it, really. You know, I mean, as a perfect example of this, I brought this very idea. I mean, when I was the president of the board of trustees of the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, oddly enough, I brought this idea forward, saying that there was a role for NRRA to play here to bring this type of thing forward. That's what our mission was: it's resource recovery. And I couldn't even get my own board of trustees to, you know, look at this, you know, just to even look and study at it. They didn't want to do it. You know, it was too easy to shoot holes in it rather than at least explore what the possibilities might be. And so, you know, just in a nutshell, what I see is one, maybe two centralized type of facilities that have a capacity of somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 tons per day of processing. And you know, municipalities and you know, the private sector would be supplying the raw materials, you know, and at a price that would be, you know, in what I've seen for economic analysis, equal to or lower than what people are paying today, but with the achieving of, you know, 80+% diversion. The difference with one of these facilities is that, you know, a lot of the post-production or post-processing manufacturing capacity is located literally on the site of this MRF on steroids, so that you know, overcome some of the problems that you know, traditional processing facilities have had with accessing markets, because they're already right there. So they become, you know, like a campus, an environmental campus. You know, like as I said before, you know, there's, you know, as you do the mass balance equation on some of the material, some of these things, the best and highest use of them would be, you know, creating a refuse-derived fuel for waste energy, and some of these materials just, you know, from a compatibility standpoint wouldn't be good for any outlet, so they would end up being landfilled. But those are much smaller fractions than what are currently being done, and the vast majority of material would be processed through these sorting systems. And the advantage is that, you know, from a collection standpoint, you eliminate the big conundrum of trying to educate people to do the right thing. People, you know, there's certainly a small fraction of people who care, who will do the right thing, but you know, the vast majority of people don't think about, you know, when they throw something away. It's not that they don't care; they just, you know, they've got some certain bandwidth. But, you know, people in this room care, and this is why we're here.
So you'd be looking at it like a single stream system.
You'd be, you know, call it a one bin system.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it takes all the guesswork out. You'd end up sending this material that's collected from residences and businesses to a you know, a transfer station, and that transfer station would then bring that material to the centralized processing facility. And the really nice thing about this is that this is ready to be, you know, built out. The private sector is as long as they understand that the waste stream is committed, and it's not a put or pay contract, which is what's vexed waste energy plants before. But they need a certain amount of material in order to make the economics work. And because these things are large, this is where the difficulty comes in. But no taxpayer dollars would need to be expended in, you know, for this. This would be, you know, it kind of, you know, it's kind of a quasi-silver bullet, as it were. I mean, it addresses all the issues that we're here to address.
I'm almost looking at like a hybrid government-private.
Well, I think that there probably needs to be some kind of a public-private partnership, in the sense that that you need to be able to source the material. That's really, you know, the critical thing. And so XYZ town, I mean, the city of Keene, for instance, if we had access to one of these facilities, my recommendation would be that we would sign a long-term agreement to supply the waste to this, assuming that they can achieve what they say they're gonna achieve. And of course, I would have to be assured that this facility was backed up by performance bonds, to indicate that, you know, they can in fact do what they say they can do. And, you know, I mean, I don't take the idea of, you know, it's really, really, really easy to turn on a faucet, but it's really hard to turn one off. And so I'm always hesitant to add new materials to my processing stream without knowing that I have the long-term ability to see that through. And this is why we've sort of stayed with our core for a really long time, because, you know, things have not borne out over time.
Setting the financing piece aside, it seems to me the government does have a role in terms of setting policy, because you'll be operating in a political environment, and you do need to have some sort of collaboration between municipalities and regional.
Well, you'd have to have municipalities agreeing to supply their waste stream that is controlled by the municipality or the governmental entity.
We're seeing more and more municipalities now that are reducing their participation in solid waste management to virtually nil. Around us, you know, you've got a city the size of Claremont, which is not a large city, but they're generating less waste at their publicly operated transfer station than a municipality of 800 people.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, John, you know, sort of to me, you know, this is not, I think that if you create this opportunity, that people can make good decisions as to whether economically, environmentally, this is the way to go. But, you know, by no means am I saying that, you know, you will be compelled to do this, you know, if you want to participate in this program. But if you've got something else that's working for you, I mean, I know, you know, that there are other reasons that, you know, transfer stations exist in my hometown of Walpole. No way could you possibly justify the existence of that facility from an economic standpoint. But it plays a bigger role in the community than just, you know, a place to bring your trash bag or your recycling. You know, it's a social gathering point. That's an important thing to that community.
Right.
But, you know, could that social gathering point remain, but, you know, it sort of configure itself differently, you know, that it's a place where you bring, you know, your one bin and then have it sent off? Yeah, I think it could be.
What I've seen in Europe is something called the eco-pole, which is sort of just an ecological center, and it's got a lot of the components you're talking about. They're also dealing with the most toxic segments of the waste stream, but it's much, much more, it's focused on education, ecology, and they've got landfills there, they've got burners, and they've got mass sorters, but it's really focused more on ecology.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I think that, you know, that I think I've heard the term eco hub or smart center bandied around. I think that's what you're talking about is you know, that the main campus of this processing facility would be, you know, an expansive environmental education opportunity in itself, but it would be achieving a very important process for us, and also limiting a lot of the problems that we all struggle with, which is, you know, is separation of material at source. You know, getting, you know, even at my facility, I mean, you know, we have, you know, a vast amount of material that goes off the end of our line because it's incompatible material, things that we don't want. And that problem's only getting worse, you know, with packaging changes and whatnot.
Well,
So-
educating the
Yeah, go ahead.
educating the legislature is key importance too, so that you're getting the right regulatory legislation coming out for these things to work, because
Right.
sometimes it does require some changes in order to make them go.
Right.
You know, we've got Senate Bill 367 in the committee right now, which the committee's been working hard on dealing with it, changing in some regulations as they refer us to advanced recycling and manufacturing facilities. You know, I've learned a ton, I will tell you, in the last 2 weeks or 3 about how some of these things that we're talking about work. And, you know, just the way that, what these businesses need to survive and work within the framework of regulatory.
Right. Well, I mean, from a state standpoint, you know, to your point, John, what maybe the state's role in it would be, you know, creating legislation to create an enterprise zone or an opportunity zone where you're taking an area that's a brownfield currently right now that may be near a rail spur that would be helpful for other, you know, back end things, and you know, and turning this, you know, this desert into a thriving, you know, economic opportunity that, you know, that has, you know, a significant amount of jobs with it. And you know, the risk is not on the public sector, the risk is on the private sector there. But I think that if you build it, they'll come.
in the interest of time, maybe we could hear some input from other folks, and in a way I'm a little concerned because your proposals are for the other committee, I think. Alternative technology is great. The MRF on steroids, I think you're talking about a fully robotic one, which is popular in Europe, but I think this committee, at least why I joined it, I thought we were going to talk more about things that aren't traditional MRF recycling technologies and steroid level MRFs. So maybe we could hear from waste energy or the new plasma technologies or food recycling.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a push. I deal in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, all the place, but you know, they sort of carved out capacity for like organic type of digester type stuff.
Composting almost.
Yeah, but then it's like then we get into this minutia about, well, is it combustion? You know, there's digesters. There's the pyrolysis. You know, is it combustion? No, we don't want to talk about combustion because it's so awful. You know, but the reality is it's not.
Right.
And then but the important thing I see. So we have material recovery facilities for C&D. We do recycling for cardboard. We have a sorting line in Connecticut, but it's like you said. If the end market isn't there, it's very difficult for the material to flow through the facility. We're having an issue right now in Massachusetts where for our C&D sorting operations, we send clean wood to 2 places that comes off that line. Either it goes to Quebec, to Tefisa to become this type of stuff, or it goes down to Plainfield, Connecticut for energy recovery. Right now, the Plainfield facility is in an outage, and then Tefisa it's either a trucking or it's a capacity issue up there where we're backed up on the clean wood side. So that becomes a difficult thing. Trucking has just been horrendous the past year. They just decided they don't show up for a variety of reasons, but so it's having that not only the front end stuff coming in, but the place for it to go. So,
Right.
but I do think it is a mix of options. It's not just one thing. And waste energy is a proven technology. It's been around. But there's some headwinds with those facilities. They're very expensive to build. You can't get a solid power contract anymore. You're at the market rate of ISO New England, which can be very good when the weather's cold or very hot, but then when it's sort of in between, it's you're not making a lot of money on the megawatt. So it's maintenance intensive, but it is proven and it does work. We've got facilities that have been running for 40 years. It just requires upkeep. So, but it is some of the also as we in Massachusetts we put another sort line in operation, so it further stresses that transport out of the wood to the end user. But we're seeing, we're in the 20s for recovery rate. I don't know, 80% really is that's an intense number to get to. You know what I mean? So I'm not saying it's not something we shouldn't strive to, but it's just going to require more and more end markets for the material you're bringing in.
Well, I mean, I think that, when I say my materials recovery facility on steroids is the primary component, it also includes these other compatible technologies like a plasma, like anaerobic digestion, composting being a primary outlet for these things. So, it's all a matter of understanding that, the waste stream, is just nothing but a series of resources that haven't been properly segregated in the way that makes them recoverable. Because it's just too easy right now to throw it into a single place and have it either landfilled or put through the incinerator. And obviously in the back end of an incinerator, you've got some recovery
Sure.
and a mass reduction, but
Well, metal recovery, aluminum recovery.
yeah, they're not insignificant. But
and finding the other, it is a zero waste technology if you take into account, we can figure out what we can do with the ash, where certain parts of the country, Florida is very progressive on, advancing reuse of the ash as an aggregate.
Right.
In Europe, that's what they recover that. They separate the fly ash from the bottom ash, and that all goes for, the bottom ash goes for reuse.
Right.
So it is being done. It's not something that's foreign. I think we kind of get bogged down, for somebody to try to bring something forward, the environment is very open-ended. They could say, well, I got this great idea, I want to do it, but there's no set start time and end time to get my project approved. It's sort of subject to, public scrutiny. It's subject to appeals. It's, they get dragged out. Maybe the regulators don't like it. So you got to have that environment, that regulatory or the legislative environment to have a pathway for that, something to go. And I think would encourage people to develop those kinds of projects.
Right. materials
Yeah.
research and ash and clinker into the roads of northern New Hampshire. I think it boils down to the political will of the people, right? So what I always enjoy doing is looking at what Europe's done, right? They have 2 millennia of experience and they have far less resources in
Right.
terms of land that hasn't been used, right? And I think we heard it at the big meeting, and I guess this committee, I wondered if we wanted to just do pie in the sky. I mean, there's some amazing stuff out there, or did we want to do stuff that's kind of ready in the next 5 years?
Well,
You
that's
know,
where
I was a
gonna-
little unsure.
I kind of jumped in. So my background is mostly in landfills, which is getting harder and harder to permit, and using the spaces as efficiently as possible is really important. So what can we divert from the landfill, which I know it's another group, but as for technologies, we can divert, but where can it go? And your comment about best and, was it highest and best use? So like composting is great, but anaerobic digester might be better because you get energy out of the same material. Right? We can have a lot of composting, we can have a lot of compost, and then it gets to what do you do with all this compost, right? But if we take it to an anaerobic digester, we'll get volume reduction, we'll get energy, and we'll get some other products that could be used for something else, or have to get disposed. I think we've had some published things like you have that reuse, reduce, recycle, right? So in my view, the landfill's holding all that up because everything else that fails has to go somewhere. So we needed landfills, and that has to be a technology that we keep. But other things like digestion or composting or whatever else there is to keep stuff out of landfill. So I think there's other technologies. And to your point, what can we implement now? So there are digesters out there that we could divert stuff. So to me, a technology is how do we better divert some stuff. So the single bin thing is great, so long as we can pull stuff out enough to make a digester work or whatever. So
you don't get cross-contamination of those things in there too.
And I've talked to some of our clients in another state about, this was probably 6 years ago, asking about, because they pick up waste, one truck, or a split body truck, so waste and recyclables, and the recyclable single stream, so there's the issue there. And I said, what about picking up organics? Well, that's a whole nother truck, right? Because you can't do a triple body because of the weights and capacities, right? You're gonna fill up one side and the other ones are empty, and so now you're adding another truck, and back then it was about $1 million a truck to get something on the road and do that. So I think there's technologies, but they're not always like the machine is the technology. Sometimes the technology is, diversion, making it easier or a process to do that.
Yeah.
And we've heard and seen that the organics is the heaviest part of what goes into the landfill. So getting that out somehow and putting that into the market, which is composting or anaerobic digesting, and then there's the pyrolysis part too. Again, that makes energy. You're left with the char. There's research on what you can do with char. I think those are more of the things on the shelf that we could stick in. It's where you're going to put it, right? So nobody wants anything in their backyard. Everybody wants it in somebody else's backyard. So that's another thing has to be overcome, and that might be legislative part of the process.
Well, I think Howard raises a good point in terms of the contamination levels, and whatever technology you're dealing with, what goes in some form is going to be coming out, including with pyrolysis. So we tend not to look at that, I think, as closely as we need to. And that's an issue with ash. If you're mixing fly ash and bottom ash, you don't really know what's coming in the front. You can be pretty sure that there's going to be some things coming out the back end that you really would rather not see.
Absolutely. That's where the practitioners and the engineers, we drill down into the weeds and you realize there's big issues here, right? I mean, the other thing I mentioned Europe because of the decades, millennia of experience, but Norway, for example, amazing at their food processing, separation, and then composting. But again, we live in New Hampshire, and most of Europe is a 50 to 60% tax structure, and they have tremendous money that they devote to this, right? We don't have that, and I don't think we ever will. So, again, being an engineer for 40 years, I learned to look at the details, and there's some great stuff out there, but can we afford it? Will the public want to do it, or will they ship it by rail car to Ohio? Hampshire's ever gonna pass a law, thou shalt not ship your waste to Ohio, because it's against the spirit of New Hampshire, so I think all those things matter, unfortunately. So, not to be negative, but that's why we get stuck.
Well, I would never say never. but-
Yeah. Well, it won't be in my lifetime, I'm sure of that. But,
Well, the type of technology that I'm envisioning, would with the 50+ sorts, would be a facility that sorts for anaerobic digestion, pyrolysis, and et cetera, as part of its sortation system, because it's just, you can't just have, a huge fraction of the waste stream going off the back end and saying, well, we're just not gonna deal with that. I mean, I think it does account for that. I mean, I would be more than happy, I know that Eric's already sort of seen the spiel, be more than happy to invite my brother up here, do a presentation to this subgroup so you can understand better and then ask questions and, all the things that you'd like to shoot holes through it. I'm quite confident that these items, all these issues have been considered. The real question is who's going to be first off the starting block for one of these. And I honestly don't think at the pace New Hampshire's going that New Hampshire's going to be the one. So by the time that we finally get around to it, you'll probably have something that you can actually go kick the tires on and see if it's something that would work. But from an analysis standpoint, I think it checks most of the boxes that we're concerned about. Yet and yes, somebody's ox is always going to get gored in any kind of process. When you try to prescribe something, somebody's going to end up on the short end of that, and they're not going to like that, right?
Well,
But-
4 of us in this room have seen that presentation. From my point of view, I think it would be very valuable to bring that before the working group.
And I've personally seen an ox get gored, and that's not pretty.
no, it's not pretty.
That's your.
But I appreciate the analogy.
Well, that's not
That's your
us.
job, Representative.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's the challenge, right? I mean, the water's always gonna be muddy in some ways. I mean, you're not gonna end up with, the perfect system that's gonna satisfy everybody.
Exactly.
But I mean, if
multi-use medication vials. You can't have a tube of this and if you open this bottle of rubbing alcohol for patient Sally, you
Yep.
can't use out of the same bottle for patient John. So everything is smaller, single patient use
Right.
devices, and that is driven by other regulatory agencies across the
Right,
country.
absolutely.
So it's not just about waste. It's
And that was
about-
what, I guess that's my
it's about
point,
patient
that,
safety.
as we look at this, there may be elements of it that, one thing we did at DHMC when a new patient came in, we gave them a menu of in-room items, like, do you need a toothbrush? Before giving them a bag of stuff, it was, do you need any of the following items to reduce the
Right.
single-use piece? Because once it's in the room, whether it's open or not,
Yeah.
it's disposed of, so.
And that's really unfortunate.
And those are not, and what I'm suggesting is that from a
No.
waste reduction standpoint, DES doesn't have a whole lot of regulatory oomph behind that. It's other regulating agencies. So outside of education, there isn't, I wrote down encourage with a question mark. How is DES going to encourage that? They're dealing with the end of the pipe. Waste reduction is at a
Before
different
it gets
end.
in the pipe,
Yeah.
right.
Right, so I think that, it's methodology, it's thinking about it.
Yeah.
Do you need a toothbrush before?
Right.
Do you need, this item before you buy it? So this, a lot of waste is at the source, and when you go to Home Depot, if you need a little bit of, X paint thinner, why do you have to buy it in gallon jugs? Can't you buy something smaller? That would be a reduction, a source reduction. Only buy what you need, rather than these giant containers that sits in everybody's basement for 3 years and nobody ever uses it till hazardous waste day. Then that becomes something different. It's about quantities and what you need and how much you need.
Right. And that's where I'm saying the regulating entities that can have an impact on waste reduction aren't in the room. So from that, other than, I like the idea of, education and things of that nature, but including something in that bill, I think makes a lot of sense. So, I'm not saying that it's a false stop, but I think as part of this, maybe identifying some of those regulated entities and have a conversation, at least within this group, that, you know, waste reduction will only happen outside this room.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because there are folks that, you know, aren't gonna be able to say, we're gonna do away with this program, right? You're gonna reuse that bottle of alcohol 5 times.
No.
DES can't make
They're-
that
no,
statement.
they can't,
Right.
right.
No, should they?
Yeah, but how do you get to the point where you can effectively make that change? That's a heavy lift, you know what I mean?
Right.
As simple as that is, it's really difficult to get to the point of saying,
Well,
okay,
I mean, I think it depends on the industry, you know, that you're
Yeah.
talking about, because there's so many across, you know,
Right.
across the state and across the country, right?
Right.
So you have, you know, healthcare is only one industry, you
Right.
have every manufacturing plant, every food service operation, you know, it really comes down to how do you minimize, you know, waste? How do you, and you first gotta actually do some like deep diving. You probably are very keenly aware of, you know, waste audits, like
Yep.
what is in this, let's see, you know, and then
Yeah.
chisel it back that way.
So we did it in, I did a 24-hour waste audit at DHMC and took from every division, room and everything in on the campus. And it was interesting to do that waste audit. At the end of it, what stood out to me really surprised me, and that was paper towels, hand towels, and discovered that DHMC was generating literally tons of paper towels. But you don't think about it because you're grabbing 1 or 2, wipe your hands and out the door. But that was one of the largest things across the campus.
And it's very bulky.
Yeah.
Very
So
bulky.
we had, that was a waste reduction option for us, and they installed hand blowers and hand dryers and air blades and stuff like that. So you're absolutely right, there's a way to look at it, but I don't think outside of education, I don't think it's something that
One,
DES.
one of the things that our company does is, you said something, you think of it, we do these industry audits. We have folks, like, for example, General Motors plant, we have 1 person now. We used to have 3 people in the plants that will look at their manufacturing process and make suggestions to them on how to reduce the amount of waste. If you avoid this step and you can do this, you can, you know, we're handling at the back end, and arguably we're generating less material for us to manage, but at the end, if we can provide that value to the customer, they're more apt to stay with us, right? Versus just going somewhere else. So we try to provide that added value. And doing those, you know, industry audits has really been valuable to us and some of our customers that haven't done it in the past. So that might be something. I don't know who would do that here.
Well, in DES, there's a group, pollution prevention, and there's, I don't even know if they're still around. There's also the Small Business Ombudsman's Office that does stuff there, in the Commissioner's Office. So there are resources, but they're limited. So
What was the name of that small business one?
Small Business Ombudsman. It's Sarah Johnson that does that. In the Commissioner's Office.
Yeah, I think something like that for the larger generators. I mean, you can do these little small efforts, and that's great. But if you go to these larger manufacturers that are generating a lot of waste, you can make a material impact
Yeah.
there. You know.
So there's a company up in Lebanon named, their name is Hypertherm.
Right. Right,
There, to
exactly
me,
right.
is
Yeah.
a wonderful case study on waste minimization at a corporate level. And I'm sure there's others, but for me, it's a local thing. And
Right.
probably 10 years ago, they made a corporate decision not landfill. But as part of not landfilling, it wasn't just, you know, very often what you see is companies making decisions that say no landfilling and instead just incinerate everything. What Hypertherm did was say, we're gonna landfill as little as possible, but in doing so, they've contacted all their upstream suppliers, and now they've replaced cardboard boxes with reusable containers. You know, if they get a part, it comes in a reusable bag or container that goes back to the supplier. So they've effectively reduced their disposal as a result, corporately. So it's
And
And
what
that-
is their product, their energy?
No, they're like a plasma torch. It's like welding equipment and supplies and things of that
Yeah.
nature. So it's a very specialized industry, but they've just decided, you know, as an entity, this is what we're gonna do. We're not gonna add to this. So.
And-
Okay, that's a good idea. I mean, I think doing those audits and using that is a good example, but you've gotta get that, you know, that industry to jump on board, right?
Yep.
Mhm.
If they don't
How
really
do you do
care or
that?
they don't have an interest, and,
It's challenging.
it's challenging, right?
So I think that definitely needs.
I would add that, yeah. I also, on the education piece, I had the solid waste operator program. Yeah, I would put that down. Suppose we can mix it, so they should leave it behind with Karen or whatever she wants.
So how much of this stuff is coming from out of state? I mean, we're getting a lot of stuff that other states aren't taking now, right? So
Right.
we're in an island around other states that have more current solid waste plans than we do.
More current what?
Solid waste plans than we have.
It's not so much current solid waste plans, it's more lack of options.
Massachusetts is closing landfills. Vermont has one landfill.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, there's no opportunities there. I mean,
Okay.
we're taking probably 50% that comes in to the turnkey facilities from out of state.
From out of state.
Yeah,
Okay.
and frankly, we could double that tomorrow.
Right.
I mean, that's how dire it is, and we just say, no, we can't do it, and we're basically turning people away.
And then upstream, but what's changing upstream to stop what's coming?
What do they
to
do?
us? That's the
Well,
problem.
what they're doing is they're trucking it. We have, we've said, no to a number of generators, and they're basically trucking it to New York State. From Boston to Rochester, New York.
But it's just getting
It's
diverted.
getting
to the
diverted.
Same.
so diverted in that
Is
case
it-
is just a different disposal facility.
Right.
It's not diversion from,
Yeah.
Bingo.
right.
And frankly, from a big picture standpoint, it's not a good alternative, right?
Right.
Because you've got greenhouse gas emissions being generated from this transportation effort to go from point A to, you know, point B times 4 or whatever it is you're gonna haul it to.
And it's not, I mean, I'm not a big
Sustainable.
fan of the word sustainable, but it's not. I mean, eventually, the location they're going to,
It's gonna fill
it's
up.
gonna fill up as well, so it's
But-
like a bridge fuel.
Yeah, but to be honest with you, there are things that there's not a good alternative, right? If you've got historic fill, and what I mean by that is you've got a brownfield project in Manchester, right? There was an old building there that was demoed and was graded off, and they put a ball field on it. Now they're gonna put a building there, and they're gonna put a cellar hole in that location. They dig it up, and there's brick and there's plastic and who knows what else is in there. You aren't gonna be able to separate that material, right? That is something that has to be landfill. I don't know any other good alternative for that. If it's a petroleum product, there are alternatives there. ESMI and Loudoun, for example, should be, you know, like a preferred approach versus going straight to a landfill.
What do they do there?
They're basically cooking the soil. They've got
Burn
a air
off the
permit.
contaminants,
Yeah.
like-
Dirt burners.
Yeah. They've got an air permit, you know, to basically, you know, ensure they're meeting compliance from the air standpoint, but
And they produce a product that's acceptable, its acceptable uses are,
for general fill.
you know, parking lots,
Right.
in different non-residential areas typically, but.
And what really should happen is that those types of facilities should be maxed out capacity wise, right? If there's, you know, capacity that they have left that they're not using, it shouldn't go to a landfill, right? The first outlet should be that type of process.
The problem is the tip fee for contaminated soils is, I mean, we're $15 a ton.
Yeah.
I'm sure ESMI is not
No, they're
less than
more.
15,
I know.
so.
You know, but let's talk about that for a minute. An example would be, okay, as an operator of a landfill, we would have to show that, if we took petroleum contaminated soil, it was only after other alternatives were at capacity.
So, I
Yeah.
like the idea, but I
Like a
fear
hierarchy.
placing that burden on a landfill.
Right.
Why not put that burden on the generator to say, you Manchester Brownfields project,
Have to
where
go
did you,
there first.
that has, you know, when your project's approved by the state,
Yeah.
you know, that's, to me, is a regulatory option for DES.
Mm.
You know, that
To pre-coordinate these things, you know when you're, I mean, you
Right.
usually know when you're gonna be constructing something on a
Right.
brownfield
Right.
or
And
contaminated.
the state
Sometimes
is
you stumble
heavily
across it
involved.
accidentally, but.
Right. Okay, so let's talk through that for a minute. I'm
Okay.
developing that project in Manchester, right?
Okay.
I'm gonna put a new hospital in Manchester at a brownfield development site, and I'm constructing this project. And I call Mark,
Yeah.
who's running this soil cooker in community X, and he says, yeah, Steve, it's $100 a ton. Okay. Then I call somebody at Turnkey or Lebanon, or I call some other location and say, yeah, it's 45 a ton. So, you're telling me, state, I've gotta go with this more expensive
Right.
alternative?
So, well, let's talk about that for a minute. So I wonder what the, you know, if there's a reasonable way to, like, if you're gonna develop a brownfield, is there any sort of
So we do this now
grants
with
or
certain
anything to
wastes.
offset the cost to deal with that waste?
So we do this with biosolids and sludge.
Okay,
You know, use this, remove the word biosolids and sludge and insert the word contaminated soils.
Right, same thing.
You know, we used to land apply, beneficially reuse biosolids. We have a different understanding of the makeup of those wastes. Now that's not a preferred disposal option. What's the preferred option? Landfill. Because the state or federal or whoever came in and said, we're not gonna approve this project, or this is an unacceptable use of this material. So I don't think it's a market decision. That is not a market decision,
Right.
that was a regulatory
Right.
decision. So in that case, DES could say, if you're generating this material, this is your these are preferred options.
Right.
Cause the state does approve these brownfields, you know, there's usually
Right.
a community development block grant associated, you know, and there's some other state or federal connection
Persistent
in there.
brownfield
Right.
redevelopment effort, right?
So, to my mind, I think that's a beautiful area for, you know, changing regulation to
Yeah.
say, okay, yes, maybe disposal is an option, but
Yeah.
only before you've, and that's a source reduction. I mean,
Yeah, only before, I mean, that's, these preferred approaches really need to be maxed out before you go into a landfill. I mean,
Yeah.
talk about the biosolids, and we operate the Crossroads facility in the state of Maine. I got a call the other day and said, Steve, can you take X amount of tons a year of sludge from Maine? I'm like, I can't accept it. It's gonna be a problem with my site, it's gonna be a stability issue. I can take some, and I do take some, but I can't take everything you're looking for, because they've passed a law that doesn't allow land application.
right, and that again is a regulatory decision
Right.
that you know, DES could,
Yeah.
in the case of contaminated soils.
Right, and, you know,
Similarly.
give you an example, and this, it's, you know, it's not New Hampshire, but, you know, that land application was being done by primarily Casella, and they didn't know this, but there's PFAS compounds in a lot of this material. The milk was contaminated, you know, the groundwater was contaminated in a lot of these facilities, it's a bad situation. But it was done really cheap, right? Now the next alternative is landfilling, which is, you know, gonna cost probably maybe 5 times what they were paying for that. But we can't handle it all, nor can Juniper Ridge. So the next alternative is an operation like pyrolysis, and that's gonna cost $180 a ton. But that's probably gonna be the solution, but it's extremely expensive. And now to go from, $15 a ton to $180 a ton, and I'm a municipality, I'm like, are you kidding me?
Right.
How am I gonna pay for this? So there's a ripple effect,
Yep.
right? Not saying that we shouldn't do what we're doing, but it's a very expensive, alternative in many cases, and that's problematic for a lot of these towns, cities. So, I mean, some of the things, I'm just looking at this list here. Petroleum contaminated soils, I think there's a good alternative there. Historic fill impacts, asbestos contaminated soils, so there's not much you can do with those types of things. Those are things that landfills should be reserved for. mixed waste soils, and what I mean by this is, Schnitzer had an operation in Madbury. They were taking auto shredder residue, and for a while there, they were landfilling it on site in an unlined area, whatever was going on. There's a cleanup activity going on, the state's running it. So it's going from Madbury, it's going to the turnkey facility, but it's soil, there's some petroleum in there, but a lot of it's auto shredder residue. How do you recycle that?
Right, that's
You
not
can't,
gonna- right.
So those, there are some things.
Contaminated soils has a number of
Right, different sections.
categories.
We have to look at each one of those and say, we can take it or we can't take it. What are the levels of contamination in there and that type of thing. But there are some alternatives for like petroleum contaminated soils that there's, viable options. The bulky waste category,
So to me, this one again has possible regulatory options. I think it's Connecticut that has a mattress recycling requirement.
Massachusetts.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
I know there's one in California, and I mean I know, landfills, mattresses, and bulky waste are a real problem. I mean, we shred a portion of our waste, but a mattress, no matter how you slice it, doesn't go far.
Yeah.
So there are recycling opportunities, but to me, identifying something like a mattress as I hate to even suggest
Excluded
disposal
waste stream,
bans,
right.
but because it's easily identified, it's not confused with something else. To me, mattresses are a possible regulatory option.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because we're dealing with that in Massachusetts. We've got, a landfill there, and we've got drop-off facilities in 2 towns that we service, and we used to landfill them. We're no longer landfilling them. We've made arrangements for some to recycle them, and they're saying we don't have capacity to recycle them, because suddenly everyone wants the
Right.
mattress recycled. So it's like the chicken and the egg, what comes first type of thing. But, in a case like that, and I'm not saying you do that, but is that, the extended producer responsibility to take back mattresses?
Oh, absolutely. I think,
Right.
or
Kind of like
As-
TVs or something, or computers.
as far as an agency that's missing at this table, and I'm glad Lynn Rubenstein is here because she kind of fills that void. Lynn Rubenstein is recycling market development. Well, New Hampshire used to have a recycling market development coordinator housed at DRED. So New Hampshire used to work on developing, identifying, pulling in, recycling companies, manufacturers who would use recycled products.
Person was at Dread?
It was at DRED. It was a guy named James Robb. And they were housed at DRED. So, and during his time here, he brought business into New Hampshire to manage some of the waste that's generated in New Hampshire.
Yep.
So, there are alternatives out there. It's not like the contaminated soils where we have capacity.
Right.
But there are opportunities to develop some of that capacity
Right.
at a state level that we're missing at the moment. But DRED used to do that.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know
I
what
mean, it was one guy, and
Yeah.
he just would attract businesses to New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Sell New Hampshire, and
Right.
where's the problem in any of that? So, that individual could, come to New Hampshire and open a mattress
Recycle,
demanufacturing
yeah, right.
facility, or
Right.
whatever. There's
Selling,
one
like,
in,
foam products or something you can do with the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there is a demanufacturing facility for mattresses up in Burlington called Sleepwell Recycling. And it's like you said, it's literally taking off. I mean, he can't keep up.
Yeah.
They're
And does he do just
demanufacturing
mattresses, or does
just
he do other
mattresses.
furniture? No, like
That's it.
sofas or anything like that?
He is busy with just mattresses.
Okay.
And I'm looking at that as a possibility, and that's a fair poke. I mean, it's not next door, but it's
And he's gotta be profitable if he's still in business,
it's
right?
he's making it work. So there are opportunities out there. It's just, unfortunately, over the years, New Hampshire has left a few things let a few things fall off the table, and that was one that was, it was an individual. It wasn't like a 12-person division.
Yeah, I think even just having one person focusing on that and trying to bring those types of industries into the state would be great.
Yeah.
You know, if you could categorize, DES could categorize, these are the areas with the largest opportunity.
Right.
You know, there's 10 of them, let's focus on the top 3.
Right.
You know,
Well,
something to make.
especially if the state on one hand is saying, you know what, we don't want you to landfill X, or we want you to stop producing this waste product. And as an industry, particularly as a landfill management, I think we miss this sometimes and I say we collectively, the burden is placed on the disposal site. When that's the end of the pipe, and when it's being received at that location, it's a mess. And it's not easy to pull these things out, whereas if on the front end, with the assistance of the state said, okay, yes, this is a priority, this is an issue, here's how we're going to address it at the state level. We're going to work on business development to create these alternative options.
I think that's a great idea. You know, that's
great idea. It does have potential end markets and use. It's something, it's a type of commodity that right now has gotten stuck in a geopolitical quagmire. And there are very few North Americans, so I'm saying North American here as opposed to just domestic, markets for used textiles anymore. They're just really diminished. Just like we saw with the value recycling, that can all change. But currently, those businesses, those charities have had to constrict the type of materials that they can take because the type of outlets that are available, because of the limitations on overseas access, has made that very, very troubling. And there's a huge number of reasons for that. So that's why I was just being a little snide. What are they going to do with it? I don't know. I mean, I live in Massachusetts, and I'm still able to take things to like Goodwill and Salvation Army, but they have they no longer want junk. They used to take, anything that was textile, and they don't do that anymore. They only want easily saleable, somewhat quality material. And that's a portion of the textile. That's not the majority of the textile that's going into the landfill.
What about carpet?
Yeah, they're in dreamland about that. Years of efforts. I mean, decades of effort around getting a carpet recycling system in place in our region. It's never taken off, and I really don't know what they're thinking. I mean, it's just, it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. It's particularly in communities where they don't have big fancy transfer stations with roofs and everything. You've got two ways for that carpet's going to get pulled. It's going to get pulled by an installer, and you can put some pressure on them and require them to ship it to southern New Jersey, the nearest place we have. That's heavy material going a long distance with very low value. Residential, you've got to keep people from getting it wet. And it's heavy and bulky, and I don't know how many of you, I couldn't move around a big roll of carpet, but the likely thing that, at least in Massachusetts, that your average human being does is that they might pull out their carpet and they roll it up and they put it outside. They put it outside to wait for it to like the rental truck or till the neighbor comes over and it gets wet, at which point it becomes garbage. So it's a big problem in landfills. There's no two ways about that. But it's I wouldn't start there. There is not a developed infrastructure in this region that could manage that.
Well, I think for the subcommittee next time we'll
your landfills, do they take C and D versus MSW? Like what's the breakdown? Is it half and half? Is it?
I think statewide is probably close to 60% MSW, 40% C&D. No, sorry. 60%
I, you mean by weight?
Yeah, by weight, tonnage. 60% MSW roughly, maybe, I don't remember, I think the other 40% is not just C&D, it's got some soil, sludge, industrial process waste, so C&D might be 15 to 20% of the remaining 40%.
Would that include bulk?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but it's
Curious.
If I had to stab at it, I'd say maybe 20-ish%.
I think most towns, when they report to DES, bulky waste is included in the C&D coverage.
Well, I just know Mark has talked a lot about mattresses and how mattresses were a big thing during COVID. I guess people were replacing their mattresses and they're just really bulky, and you know, if you're looking at your landfill space, it takes a lot. So I think Massachusetts passed a law that is requiring recycling of mattresses.
It will be going, not a law, they have this really clever little law that doesn't require there to be legislative action in order to add disposal bans. So the DEP just does due diligence and then makes an announcement, which is what they've done. So mattress is being added, I think it goes into effect on September 1st. You know, looking at the list, speaking of, you know, a problem for landfills, I'm surprised not to see tires on this. Tires are a real serious problem in landfills. They bob, you know, they migrate back up, and they're heavy, and you know, they don't compress. I mean, they have all these, you know, really landfill unhappy characteristics. And that's one of the more, I mean, almost universal around the country. If you're going to have a disposal ban, it's going to be tires and lead acid batteries. Those are the two.
There is a rule on tires on if you do landfill them and how they have to go into the landfill, and that's in 905. It's in our rules. So it's not a ban, but there is something about it.
And lead acid batteries are banned in England.
They're banned. Yep,
They
that's
are.
part of the ban.
That falls under wet cell, Mike?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Good.
I mean, so we do have bans, and they're not, you know, we have done this before, so. But I think we need to target some of these, well, I think tires is a really good place to start. We've already initiated that. And that would get at our tonnage.
But once again, I think most transfer stations recycle their tires.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like they have a pile where you put them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they take them at all, I know
Yeah,
in my
some places.
town, they don't take them, so I don't, and then I guess a lot of garages collect them.
Yeah.
They probably sell, maybe they sell. People do, what do they do with tires? Do they burn them? No, I know, I mean, I have no idea.
Last year, the year before, I published a document about what happens to tires. One of the more boring projects I've ever had. But I can tell you, there's like two things that happen. In our region, the majority of it goes to what's called, becomes crumb rubber. So you can almost picture that. And then there are a limited number of waste to energy facilities on the East Coast that are permitted to burn tires. It's not really common, which was surprising to me. But I have this document which lists all of the disposal opportunities and end markets for tires in the 11-state region. And I'll be happy to share that. It was mind-numbing. But it's all there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be good.
Good.
New England does do a good job with tire recycling. You look at, like, I believe Colorado up there, or Utah, one of the states over there, they have this huge pile of tires which they're just, it's ungrown.
because there have been EPR laws for mattresses passed in abutting states. And there are well-developed markets for mattress recycling in our region. And so it makes it a relatively easy thing to ban, because there's a trade association, mattress recycling council, that manages all of this stuff in the EPR programs, but they also are the ones that have the relationships with all these recyclers. So we have an established mattress recycling network in our region.
Is that all down in Mass or further south?
Well, the existing laws are Connecticut and Rhode Island.
No, the network itself, the demanufacturing.
Oh, where are the facilities? Connecticut, Massachusetts, they're not in Rhode Island, there's really good regions in Rhode Island. And I think there's also some in New York State.
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly whose realm this fits in for the subcommittees, but there is this whole issue of EPR, which is, I mean, I feel like it could fit here. We're talking about recycling, and the whole idea of required recycled content as a way of creating markets is really important. So, I mean, I think also of procurement policies by the state, for instance, that could help foster some markets. But I mean, I think that fits within this group, don't you? That issue. Mm-hmm.
That's definitely needed,
Right.
you know, between, as you said, mattresses, paint, electronics, you know, it is definitely
Yes, and your
needed.
surrounding states, for paint and electronics, have those laws.
Yeah.
So, not Massachusetts, they never passed EPR, but, so you have a regional model that you could refer to.
Right, and I think it gets back to, of all the things we're gonna propose, I almost feel like we need to rank them based
Right,
on
I agree with you.
lowest hanging fruit to highest, you know, to like most difficult, like what can we actually, like not to say let's not try something just because we think it won't get, you know, passed through legislation,
no,
but like
what's realistic.
I'd love to see us, once we really, you know, have a few more meetings, like try and rank these in order of priority. I mean, like C and D and food waste, right? Like those are huge items taking up landfill space. Like I'd love to see us spend more time on those than talking about paint, although paint is a great one to follow, right? But I mean, just in terms of capacity.
Right. I do like the idea of mattresses too, though, for a lot of reasons. Well, and that, you know, and then there's this whole world of plastics out there. That people really care a lot about plastics and throwing plastics away, but I was thinking about our diversion goals, and if you're focused on tonnage, doesn't weigh as much.
Yeah.
So I almost feel like our diversion goals maybe at some point have to focus on more than tonnage someday, but anyways. And we haven't talked
there
about.
are states in our region who no longer use tonnage as their goal. So there are conversations that could be had, you know, examples presented about different ways that states are setting these goals and how they're measuring it.
And yet we have a brand new goal based on tonnage.
Yeah, we do have a brand new goal that's for, I mean, which was definitely an improvement, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about it, you know, because it doesn't, if you focus just on weight, you're not getting at issues that are also really problematic that just don't weigh as much. So,
Yep.
you know, I don't know. Anyways, I mean, I think we sort of danced over glass. My impression is that glass actually is kind of an issue.
It's a huge issue.
What's the legislative history of the bottle bill? I know there's been debated.
Like dozens of times,
dozens
I
of
think.
times.
Dozens of
Dozens.
times.
Dozens of times.
And then is it that it just doesn't get anywhere? Is it like resoundingly defeated? Is it?
I don't pretend to know all there is to know about it. I mean, Reagan, actually, maybe you, why don't you talk about it? You may know more. Because I thought that there's this whole issue about how the collection of a lot of these bottles can help to be a revenue generator for municipalities, and there was some resistance to, I mean, I don't know. But dozens, I mean, going way back.
So I sent a reporter to Mark Morgan to talk about the bottle bill earlier this year because I knew he had more history on it. Hold on a sec. He recalls similar attempts to pass this legislation at least 30 times, much of which was credited to Hopkinton's Derek Owen, who died in 2020. Owen served 20 terms in the legislature and would perpetually file bottle bills, tweaking them from one session to the next. So, there's a lot of history there.
A lot of history there. Well, actually, he's not on the subcommittee, but Clark used to work for people opposing bottle bills, so I don't know if you want to just share your knowledge.
I'd be glad to give you a very brief history. I was a lobbyist for 42 years in this state, principally responsible for killing bottle bills. The first bottle bill in this country since 1943 was passed by Oregon in 1971 to become effective in 1972, which was when I was hired by the New Hampshire Wholesale Beverage Association, essentially the beer distributors. There were 38 bottle bills before I retired that were defeated. The one that came the closest to being passed was in 1983, and the beer distributors exchanged a 66% increase in the beer tax from 16 to 30 cents a gallon in exchange for the guarantee veto by Governor Sununu at the time. The PERGs in the state, particularly Dartmouth College, Patty Blanchett, Elizabeth Green, Mike Cornelius, and so forth, put on a valiant fight to pass it. I now regret having done that. I really do. So my associate, whose phone went off, and I'm going to have a word with her about that, and I just formed a collaborative solid waste strategies group, a nonprofit, to support this solid working group, particularly Reagan, Brian, transfer stations, groups. And so our forte is lobbying, and we're 100% behind you, but I could give you days of testimony on the bottle bill. Initially, it was the issue of litter. You know, and they would try to pass it when the snow melted because ingresses and egresses on the by-states and so forth, it was just such an eyesore. Elmer Johnson, who was a representative from Winchester, actually testified one time that his cows were eating so much metal cans that the milk tasted tinny. But it is very hard in this state, as this committee knows so well, to get positive legislation passed. But we're going to try to help you.
Well, yeah, so there's cans, there's plastic bottles, and there's glass. So, you know, if you were gonna focus on a bottle bill, doesn't mean it has to have all three things in it. You could start with glass, I mean, I don't know. But glass is just, it weighs so much and it's so hard. I mean, you know more about it than, I mean, I've really been interested in trying to use glass for public works projects, but it's this whole chicken and egg thing.
Just noticing that we're almost up on our time.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here with our committee? I mean, I like the idea of if for the next meeting, if we have another hour and a half, I mean, I think we would need it.
I like your idea of prioritization as we, you know, I think we need to continue to flush this out, but I like that. You know.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot on the table, but now we gotta figure out where do we start?
Yeah.
Right.
Let's start with the, if we're trying to work towards diversion, let's work on the big tonnage items.
So do you just wanna, and we can see what the other people, have to say, but you wanna just, your subcommittee meet again before the regular meeting, or do you wanna do something separate? That's up to you guys.
I'm good meeting whenever. I mean, it makes it, this really works, you know,
Right, certainly
scheduling wise,
the next
you know,
month, yeah. I mean, I guess it's a question of sort of timing and deadlines. I mean, I could see on the one hand, I clean up these notes and share them out, and we all kind of do some brainstorming on like what are those big areas, and then we come back and we meet again with all of us with some ideas of like low hanging fruit, pie in the sky, and rank them and try and flesh out the most promising things.
Yeah, and this is to inform your work.
Right.
Like, you know, so with that timeline, so the next meeting is what, the end of May?
In a month.
Yeah, in a month. So does that work for your timeline for getting these reports? What are you looking for from the committees? Like what timeline?
I think it might be helpful to have a.
Yeah, the whole group, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me know when you want to officially. Okay, well, let's have like, people are starting to come back, so let's start it up in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Why don't we just, I mean, how did that work for people? Do you like the idea of breaking up? Because we talked, I stayed with the recycling group, we talked a little bit about how we wanted to operate in the future, at least in the short term. Do you like the idea of just having the subcommittee meet right before the regular meeting? Okay. And we might even want to let the subcommittees roll for 2 hours and have our meeting for an hour or whatever. I mean, I think there's flexibility here as we sort of figure this out. So then, I don't know what the date is, but so we'll have the subcommittees meet before the next regular meeting again. I mean, if subcommittees want to meet more frequently than that, I mean, you can do that. It may evolve that you want to once we have a draft to work with. And so I sort of warned Mike Nork I was going to ask him this question. So I wondered if you had some sense of when we might have a document to look at.
For the solid waste management plan, kind of the outline. So I think the last meeting I wasn't present at, Mike Wimsatt mentioned that we hired Paige Wilson to join us in the Solid Waste Management Bureau, and she and I are actually working on that right now and trying to figure out what might be included, you know, what kind of like just kind of the bullet points and have an outline. So we might be able to have a rough draft by the next meeting, which I'm not sure has the committee decided that they're meeting monthly now?
Yeah, well, I think we need to.
I have it on the 27th on my calendar.
Okay. Because I know I had set up
Monthly.
regularly scheduled dates every other month and then reserve dates in between.
Yeah.
But if it's officially decided by the group that they want to just use all of those dates, I can, you know, put that on the calendar and make sure that that's noticed publicly. So if the next meeting is going to be May 27th, that could be a target for having an outline.
So, folks agree that monthly is sort of in order at this point? I think we've got some work to do. Okay. All right. So, let's see. We'll just start at the top with Subcommittee 1, waste reduction. Yeah, I just thought if you guys wanted to share, people wanted to share what went on in the subcommittees.
Sure, I'll report out.
Okay.
I came a little prepared. I gave some thoughts a couple days ago to just have some talking points for the group. So if you looked at what Mike sent out earlier, there are 2 main categories. This is how I read it. Waste reduction and management of difficult waste. Like we broke up conversations in the group into those 2 categories. Under waste reduction, a lot of the conversation focused on education. And we've heard about that over and over, but there's different levels of education that could be performed at. It could be information that gets handed out to cities and towns at the town hall for handouts. It could be more elaborate information on waste reduction efforts that goes to the solid waste committees that they could implement into their programs. We talked about for those communities that have large industries or manufacturers to do waste audits. It's something our company does for our larger customers. We'll go into a manufacturing facility and look at ways that they can be more efficient, reduce the waste that they're generating. It doesn't apply to all the municipalities, but for those communities that have large generators, that might be something worth looking at doing. And does that get provided by, you know, one person at the DES that has that expertise, or do you require or suggest or ask that the waste provider who's got a container there servicing that generator provide that service? Either somebody in-house or they hire a consultant to come and do that to try to minimize waste for these larger generators. So that's something that we talked about. Also, Senate Bill 380, there's going to be a requirement, it hasn't passed, but it will pass, that municipalities generate a solid waste management plan. And this group's going to be tasked with defining what that is and what components are there. In that, maybe we require or ask that municipalities include in that what their waste reduction efforts are. What are they doing? Are they implementing recycling programs? Just to put it out there so that they can start thinking about it at the solid waste committee level and implement programs. It's at the transfer station. However it gets done, that should be a component, we think, of that plan that comes out eventually. The solid waste operator training program, maybe that's something that gets included. I don't know if it is now, it's a long time since I've gone through that, but maybe that's a discussion on waste reduction, a component of that, because those folks that are managing these transfer stations have to go through that program. So we thought that was something that was worthwhile. So, and then also we talked about education programs at the elementary and the middle school level. That's something our company does, and we found that it's really important, you know, if you start at a young age educating folks and getting them to understand, obviously, you know, we're not doing it, we're providing, you know, programs that the social studies teacher could roll out or whatever for a week or whatever. But they go home and they tell mom and dad, why are you throwing that in that bucket? That needs to go in this bucket, right? We're gonna recycle that, or just, so those are just some of the things that we could do from an education standpoint on the waste reduction side of things. We talked about difficult to manage waste, different categories there, and I just went by the list that Mike had in his email to us. Contaminated soils. That comes in a variety of different types. If it's petroleum contaminated soil, there's an outlet for that. I'll just mention ESMI in Loudon. There's an alternative there. That should be the preferred approach. If there's a cleanup activity, you know, we should maximize those types of facilities first before it goes to landfilling. Other materials, historic impacted, historic fills, cleanup, brownfield redevelopment activities. You really don't have a lot of options but to landfill that material. Asbestos contaminated soil, same thing. You're not going to recycle that material. Mixed waste. There's a cleanup project going on at Madbury Metals. DES is driving that project. It's got petroleum, you know, impacts. It's got waste oil impacts. It's got auto shredder residue in soil. You really can't recycle that. Those are the kind of things that, you know, you end up having to landfill. We talked about bulky waste. We talked about mattress deconstruction. That's something that state of Massachusetts is doing. There's a capacity issue for those types of processing operations now. Can we attract a business like that to New Hampshire? We talked about there was someone at DRED years ago, Mark brought up, whose responsibility was to bring in those types of businesses into the state. Maybe that's something we can look at. I mean, I know it costs money to do these things, but it's something that should be considered. You know, clean wood, pallets, you know, we're still getting those things in roll-off containers that are getting delivered to us. It really shouldn't come into the landfill. We're pulling those out and it becomes a problem. It should just be chipped, sent to somebody who's doing recycling, being used for fuel. Stumps, we see that on a lot of bottom of 30-yarders, that's leaf and yard waste in our estimation, but, you know, good example, someone's building a house, there's 3 stumps, contractor puts in the bottom of 30-yard and throws a bunch of C&D demo on the top of it, you know, that type of thing, those kind of things happening. PFAS problem, furniture, you know, those are really gonna have limited, outlets for that. I mean, everybody know, I think, a lot of people probably know what's going on in the state of Maine right now with biosolids. Land application's not happening up there anymore, and they know they understand the problems with the milk, groundwater impacts because of the amount of biosolid land application that took place. Now the state of Maine is looking to the landfills to take this material. There's not capacity to do that. There's options that are out there, but they're very expensive. So that's another conversation that should take place. The other thing here was C&D. We have, Greg wasn't here with us today. He's oversees ERCO, Epping, and another similar type operation in Salem. So we have capacity to do that. That C&D comes in different forms. ABC, asphalt, brick and concrete, can be reground and used for civil projects, road-based, that type of thing. And then other C&D, grinding clean wood for fuel, metals recycling. Sheetrock removal is really important. A lot of these sites, the ground product that comes out is used as ultimately cover at these landfills. I will tell you, probably ERCO does the best in pulling out sheetrock, because if you don't pull it out, it creates a whole nother problem with H2S. But those are things that need to be components of these operations that have recycling activities on site. Then we talked about biosolids, industrial sludges. You really don't have a lot of opportunities to do something with that. That really should be landfilled. POTW sludges, again, landfilling that, composting, pyrolysis, something our company's doing and looking at, but it's very expensive. Use the example up in Maine, folks who are land applying biosolids in the state of Maine, and I'll pick a number, $25 a ton to do that, right? By the time you leave point A, get it on the fields, get it spread. That's no longer acceptable there. Now they want the landfills to accept it. We operate a landfill up there. We don't have capacity. They have a landfill, the state of Maine. They don't have capacity. They think they do, but you can only take so much before you create other problems. But that's twice as much, or even 3 times as much. Pyrolysis is going to cost another $100 on top of that. So there's alternatives out there, but they're very expensive. So that's something that could be done. But I will tell you this PFAS issue, I won't say it's emerging anymore. It's in front of us. We're dealing with it everywhere. That's going to really restrict what we're doing. So that's something that we need to keep in mind too. So those are some of the categories. There's more. We ran out of time. That's kind of a synopsis.
Anybody from the subcommittee want to add anything else?
So one of the other pieces that we talked about is just from a regulatory standpoint, under the kind of the concept of waste reduction, that DES really doesn't play a big role regulating products on the front end. DES is primarily end of pipe. So from a waste reduction standpoint, having to go to the front of the pipe involves Health and Human Services, National Fire Protection Association. There's a bunch of other regulating agencies that have an impact. Food safety issues that restrict reuse and things of that nature that are not at the table, which is okay, but it's important to identify those are some of the barriers that will be difficult outside of education. Because you can tell people to do something, but if there are regulations that restrict that activity, it's going to be challenging. So.
Anybody else? Anybody have any questions? I just have a question on PFAS. I mean, I have a sense of where the PFAS come from, but what categories of things have PFAS on them, or what doesn't? Yeah, that's what I was going to say. What doesn't? I mean, it's clothes.
Everything. There's 9,000 compounds out there with some, types of PFAS components. You buy Scotchgard covered furniture. That's got PFAS in it. Carpeting, it's got PFAS in it. Your nice Gore-Tex jacket you just bought from L&B, maybe I just bought. we bought a few years ago, has PFAS on it. Rain-X you put on your windshield to keep that stuff coming off. The stuff that's sprayed on your car wash after you drive through so it doesn't streak. It's got PFAS. It's dental floss, stuff you're putting in your mouth. They don't do that anymore, I hope. But I mean, there's a lot. And the problem is, we import a lot of products into this country. Right? We're moving forward. A lot of times, we're seeing a lot of legislation in advance of the science, which is problematic. Which I'll state that right now. But if you import products, I'll just use dental floss for an example. It's coming from China. They're not regulating it. They don't really care. You're buying this product, and it may or may not have it still in there. So it's in a lot of materials that we're using. I got a shirt on from LL Bean. It doesn't wrinkle. The reason it doesn't wrinkle, in the fabric is probably that product. I haven't tested it, but I would bet you money. This stuff is everywhere. So it's not good. It's a problem that is growing, and it's going to impact everything.
It's a big topic, and as a result, like we were talking about, like if you're recycling these chairs, there may be some recyclers who are not interested in these chairs any longer because of the PFAS components in the cushions in the chairs. That there may be some regulatory burdens associated with processing these, and the auto shredder residue now containing PFAS. So it's not just how do we deal with PFAS waste, but there are things we're discarding that have PFAS in them that will have an impact on, I don't want to say their recyclability, but processing costs associated with their recyclability. It's complicated.
Yes. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. So then the next study committee is recycling and composting. Did you want to do the report on that?
Sure, yeah. So we covered a lot of different topics. Like the first group, we wanted to sort of get a lot of things on the table. And then at the end, I'll talk about sort of next steps that we were envisioning. But we started off talking about pay-as-you-throw, some really good success stories there in terms of the city of Concord and Lancaster. We did talk about the sort of the difficulty of recycling for multifamily housing. Although Vermont does require that everyone is recycling in Vermont, regardless of if it's rural or if you're in a multifamily housing unit. We talked a fair amount about infrastructure and regionalization. Are there ways we can be incentivizing recycling and composting infrastructure in New Hampshire? Of course, one of our challenges is just we don't have a lot of tonnage. That's why we don't have a lot of, that's why we don't have a single stream earth in New Hampshire. So that kind of moved us over to talking more about regionalization. How can we better support municipalities with consolidating material in a regional way so that they can get access to more markets, decrease their costs? That got us into conversations about permitting, how easy is it for a municipality to help out another one and take in recycling for another community? What are those steps that they have to take? And Mike had offered to look into that a little bit more for us because we think there's a lot of potential there beyond communities forming a formal solid waste district. Just one community maybe accepting material from another, and what do they need to do with their permit to make that a reality, and who is to do it appropriately. We talked a fair amount about food waste and composting. Again, there's infrastructure challenges there, but some opportunities exist in terms of, there are trucks that are going from Massachusetts through New Hampshire to get to Maine to take material to anaerobic digesters there. Could we do a better job of making sure that the communities that want to participate in diverting their food waste could be accessing those truck lines? Lynn shared that in Connecticut, a strategy they had was to pass a law saying that you couldn't landfill food waste if you generated a certain tonnage, like large generators, and if there was proximity to a facility that could manage that waste, and that actually had the incentive of incentivizing investors to come in and build infrastructure, because then they knew if they built something, they would have a certain guaranteed tonnage within a radius of them. So that's something we had talked about. We did talk a bit about anaerobic digesters, although we also, recognize that that is really more under the scope of the third subcommittee, but talked a bit more about that. We did start talking about capacity, and what can be done to address the fact that we've got, a fair amount of trash coming in from out of state that seems to really be concerning to a lot of people. We talked about Vermont and how they have their solid waste implementation plans that really put a pretty high burden, a very high burden, on anyone who wants to dispose of trash in Vermont. Talked about if there are some components of that that might work in New Hampshire. We also discussed a bit a topic that Mark has brought up in the past, that years ago apparently DES did work with our unlimited service area landfills to negotiate how much waste, sort of on a voluntary basis, how much waste can come in from out of state. And we were curious to get a few more details on it, but we touched on that. We talked a bit about funding opportunities for DES. Talked about the bill in New Hampshire for a disposal fee surcharge, and how you really can't put a higher fee on out-of-state waste because it would violate the Commerce Clause, but the bill was designed to kind of have a workaround for that, essentially charge everyone the same amount, and then provide grants only to New Hampshire communities and businesses. But the actual surcharge got stripped from the current bill that's in place. And then in trying to sort of prioritize where we go next, we talked about, our diversion goal is based on weight, right? So even if maybe we want to delve into plastics, the fact is that that's not a big area of weight, right? So if we're looking at weight going into our landfills, food waste, C&D, which we already talked about, glass, paper, textiles, these are some of the big areas that we thought we might want to spend more of our time and attention on, instead of attempting to cover all of this in our recommendations. We reviewed the current landfill bans that we have and discussed whether there might be any sort of obvious things that we want to think about landfill bans for. Talked about mattresses, and then we did talk a little bit about EPR and procurement policies, and just a discussion of what other states are doing in this area. But really at the sort of the end of the meeting, what we decided that we would plan on doing for our next meeting is to basically review all of these notes and then sort of prioritize what are the largest tonnage items that are under the purview of this committee, and then thinking about how we can identify sort of lower hanging fruit recommendations, things that are perhaps more realistic to get done sooner, and then also getting all the way into things that might be nice to look at, but perhaps are going to be less realistic to actually accomplish here in New Hampshire, given policy and political climate. So that's sort of where we're going to go next, is honing in this list that we worked through. Anything to add?
Nice work.
I mean, the only thing I would add is just going back to the disposal surcharge. I think, a lot of the issue with recycling has to do with the development of an infrastructure to sort of accept what you're trying to recycle, and it would be very interesting, or a good way of promoting that, if you could have public-private partnerships to try to support the infrastructure, and also to give a little bit more support to DES. So at some level here, we really are going to have to hone in on the whole funding issue. It can't all be federal funding.
So one thing that Steve brought up that we did talk about in our group was, years ago, the state of New Hampshire had a position housed at DRED, Department of Resource Economic Development. That position was called the Recycling Market Development Coordinator. His name was James Robb. He worked very closely with organizations like NERC, who Lynn Rubenstein is here representing, and his job was to develop markets for recycled products. To your point, and then budget cuts come along and those positions go away. So on some level, we're talking about increasing diversion, but at the same time, we also need to be talking about market development and making sure that there are markets to support this additional diversion. I mean, we hear the word capacity everywhere. It's not just landfill capacity, but it's also diversionary activity capacity. So, you know, that was one position. So we talk about the you know, grant programs and all these other things for whatever, but an individual, to me, is a low-hanging fruit. And the reinstatement of that position, I think, would go a long way in assisting answering a number of questions about what do we do with this stuff. So
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really important. Yeah. I mean, and that's where you get into EPR and all that stuff. But like with anything, money does become important. Based on the work that our recycling study committee did, I think DES had generated some information that goes back a while that like the vast number of states in the United States have this surcharge that is used to fund a lot of the solid waste activities and to, you know, and to feed it back into the state through grant programs and stuff would be helpful. Anyways, any other comments on that? Okay, so then the next subcommittee was the alternative waste management technologies.
I'm the scribe. I'll be glad to kick it
Okay,
off and
thank
then
you, Jim.
pass it around to my colleagues. Yeah, I thought we had a really good spirited discussion. We talked about technologies and the challenges we've all faced in different fields for coming with an innovative alternative technology. Things that kind of bubbled up to the top were some discussions about some form of anaerobic digestion leading to recycled natural gas, maybe revisiting landfill mining, which is really working on closed cells. Eric brought that up. We revisited waste to energy and had a really good discussion about all those so-called triple bottom line factors that play in, like, can you afford it? Is it technically doable? Is it environmentally doable? Is it political and societal acceptance of it? You know, if we create electricity or recycle natural gas, someone has to take it into the grid or that technology is challenged. So we talked a lot about that. We talked about trying to find alternatives that are ready for the here and now. They've either been scaled up or you know, maybe are at the advanced research and development stage, particularly in my experience at DOD or DOE. They usually put a lot of money into things. And then just judging from head nods in the room, I think there was general consensus that Duncan was going to talk to you, Representative Abell, about the potential for his brother Rob Watson to speak here to the whole group from Upland Roads. Rob is acknowledged in the architectural field as one of the founders of LEED certified buildings, so that we're throwing out there. We talked about plastic reuse possibilities. I think we echoed a lot of the comments from the prior group that what are the big items going in landfills right now and how can we work on diverting them, and plastic wasn't one of them. It was food or things we could digest into a usable gas. So let me leave it at that and kick it over to my group mates if I may have missed something. Or
I think you did a pretty good job covering.
Thank you, buddy. I should say Representative Pearl also reminded us that the legislature cares a lot about if a facility is put in that's innovative, that it doesn't become an environmental liability or hazard down the road, which we have many sins of the past that wound up from that. So yeah, thank you. Yep.
I mean, I think that's a really important point. Yeah. So, and the other thing that actually came up in our committee is at some point the way this all crosses with energy policy, green energy, you know, and using methane or, you know, and somebody mentioned something about, what was it, energy? I guess it was Lynn was talking about energy credits.
Energy credits.
Correct.
And I don't really know what the structure is right now for how that relates to landfills, but we could look at that. I mean, I could see a place in advanced technologies for how you guys talk some about, maybe you could talk more about that.
Yeah, I think we did talk a little bit about what's going to tip the scale, because a lot of these alternatives have price tags that start to creep up to, let's say, $1 billion. I said 100 million, and that was too low. And so who's gonna pay for that? Who's gonna take the risk? And angel investors and selling it to the private sector is probably the only way, unless DOD or DOE was gonna pay for it. So credits sort of help tip that balance, right? Recycled natural gas, for example, it's pipeline quality, so we could send it all over the place, could send it to California, and if there are the right credits, maybe the economics work, So I think that is a huge deal. I really do.
I don't know if Steve or Mark know anything about what you could add on that.
There's a couple different things. Renewable energy credits, the landfill gas projects that we have qualify for that. So there's a benefit from a payment standpoint for the power generated by those projects. And wind projects fall into that category as well. There's also something else called RINs. RINs would be similar to what we're doing with UNH. We're just providing them the gas. But if UNH, if they have the ability in their contract, if they get more gas than they need at the campus in UNH, for lighting, heating, cooling, whatever, they can sell that gas through a turbine to the grid. And there's RINs that are available. That
What's RIN? I had to
renewable
ask.
incentive energy credits or something. And what that is that there are municipalities, states requiring so much renewable energy being used in, like, the state of New York, for example. You have to have alternate. New York's a whole other conversation. There's a new law, CLCPA there. It looks at limiting greenhouse gas emissions, and it's pretty significant relative to the requirements that they've got. The point is, there are utilities that are required to come up with alternative power sources, and these types of projects are at a premium. So if you have to pay, just pick a number, if you get paid 10 cents kilowatt hour for gas coming out of the turnkey landfill gas energy project, if there's a RINs project built, that 10 cents would be $1. Not quite that great, but significant increase. So financially, there's huge incentive to do those types of projects, because utilities are required by law to come up with these alternate power sources, and there's very little available. So supply and demand, it gets bid way up, and because of that, these projects are at a right here.
I decided to bring it up. Renewable, it's EPA, renewable identification numbers. And actually what UNH has debated in their council, and unfortunately we've never had extra gas, but for example, if we used gas,
We do have it, Jim.
we got a lot of gas at UNH. But if we could make electricity, I'm glad you said that. If we could make electricity and sell it to the grid, it may allow EverSource to back off on some of their higher polluting generators, and so EverSource would pay UNH for that. That's where the money would flow. So I think we used to do that pollution credit trading type of thing for the air pollution as well. So it's that kind of thing. Yeah.
So anyway, but that in the value of that fluctuates like commodity month to month. It's really high right now. Everyone's going after it. In 2 years, when you finally get to a project to go to the street where that's going to make sense, that dollar may be 11 cents. You don't know, but there's a risk there that you take unless you can get to market ASAP. There's risk there because they're very expensive projects to build. But you're creating pipeline quality gas through renewable sources.
Matt does waste to energy. Is there anything?
As far as?
I don't know. Anything you want to say?
Not on this topic. I mean, depending on where you are in the country, we get renewable energy credits in Massachusetts. We participate in a part of that what drives that program is it's kind of an interesting thing. Is 10 times a quarter a third-party inspector comes to our facility and actually inspects the waste coming onto the tipping floor, and they're characterizing what do they see, and every quarter all 3 of our sites submit that to the DEP, so it's sort of a ongoing tracking of what's in the waste stream. And every 3 years we actually do a waste characterization study where we literally have 10 or 12 day laborers off to the side of the tipping floor, and then we'll dump a bucket load of trash, and they'll count the Q-tips and the toilet paper rolls and the diapers and the whatevers, and come up with a really intense look at what's in the waste stream. It's everything we've been talking about. It's the organics, it's paper, it's plastic. But we participate in that. We were able to sell those credits, and the Mass Department of Environmental Protection actually gets half of the revenue under this program from those sales. That goes into it's called a Green Communities Act fund, where municipalities can apply for grants to enhance their recycling or do new recycling efforts in their communities. So we've been doing that for probably 12 years now. It's been going on. But yeah, the utilities buy the credits, and we get the money, and we split it with the DEP, and they funnel wherever those programs. So we've got some examples of those things going on.
It's a tricky rabbit hole going down the RINs hole, and my exposure to it was with our project where we replaced our landfill gas energy system because the landfill gas was depleting to the point because when we covered our landfill, we basically fossilized the biological decomposition process that we had, and when the landfill gas started sputtering, we needed to replace our system because we don't have 3-phase power located on our site. So we did a project using some EPA grant funds to put in a 100% biofuel generator operating off of post-consumer biofuel. But when we started sourcing the 100% biofuel, the 100% biofuel was $1 more expensive than B99.9 because of the RINs credit. Now that didn't make a lot of sense to me, but and it still doesn't, to be honest with you. But the reason that we're able to, I had to then reconfigure the whole application process to the DES to allow for petroleum diesel to be burned in this generator because of the 0.1% that was now going into it based on the RINs credit, because we were accessing B99.9. And so the B99.9 is nothing more than taking an existing diesel fuel truck, emptying it out, putting it full of the biofuel that you want, but then the residual that's in there is the 0.1% of the fuel. But that's what allows you to qualify for the RINs credit and get the biofuel that you're looking for more economically feasible for the project. So go figure how B100 doesn't qualify for a RINs credit, but B99.9 does. It's just baffling to me.
Did you want to add anything?
We have a landfill gas project underway in Lebanon. So as another aside of how do you economically fund some of these projects, what Lebanon did is the city did work through legislature and increase the allowability of offsets and net metering. So what the city of Lebanon will be doing is offsetting its load from the landfill. So basically we've established 30-year energy costs for ourselves. So the electricity, theoretically, for the city of Lebanon government buildings and such will be generated and produced from landfill gas. So Lebanon will be renewable energy in the next couple of years. And to Steve's point, as far as those couple of years, it does take time to get everything in place. And since we're our own customer, it's a whole lot easier. So now we will know our electrical costs for the foreseeable future. Plus we're generating we're going to produce more than we require, so then we can find other off-takers, and it becomes, to Duncan and Steve's points earlier about the value of these renewable energy opportunities. So there's a multitude of ways to do it, but it is complicated, and navigating it can be very tricky. And 1 year to the next, landfill gas projects were, a grant opportunity or a tax deferment for third-party investors. That is no longer the case. So, tax laws have implications as well. So just understanding what some of the financial opportunities are out there can be a full-time job in and of itself. So.
Okay. All right, well, we didn't already know all of this is complicated, and has so many nuances to it. So, well, really good work, I think, this morning. So, if the consensus of the group is that we just meet again right before our next regular meeting, I think that that's what we'll plan on doing. Do you like the hour and a half idea? Would you rather go for 2 hours and 1 hour? Hour and a half is good?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I know. All right. Okay, so that's what we'll do, and then we'll just plan on meeting monthly. We'll format it that way. Mike says he thinks we'll have something from the department to start digging into for our next meeting. We'll string you up if that's not.
No
anyway,
pressure.
I'm kidding. No pressure. No pressure. I just hear it everywhere. Yeah. So that's good. All right. Well, so that's the subcommittee part of it. I did ask Mark if he would do. Okay. Sorry, Mike.
Just a formality, the group may want to approve minutes from the previous meeting.
Oh yes. Sorry. Okay. Did anybody have any comments on the minutes? No? Okay. All those in favor of, or all those who want to approve the minutes as written indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you for that. Okay, so I had asked Mark Morgan if he would do sort of a landfills 101 for us, and I know there's a lot of you that are at, landfills 400, but some of us aren't at landfills 400, so Mark is going to touch on some issues quickly for us, and then we'll have a legislative update, and that'll be a wrap. All right. Mike, how does this work?
Maybe it doesn't.
Well, you didn't ask me
20
for
minutes
mine.
screen never works.
All right, just tell me when to go for it. I'll do it.
So thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. And Karen's right when she asked me. I was like, there are people in this room that know far more than I do, and frankly, I've learned, in my career from a lot of you. So I, give kudos to everybody in this room as well. For those who don't know, I manage the City of Lebanon's landfill, located in Lebanon, New Hampshire. It is a municipally owned and operated landfill. Eric Steinhauser, Sanborn Head, and his crew are the engineers of record. So they've done a lot of great work with us for several years. I'll get into a little bit more later as far as what we are, but this is a very high level look, not the landfill 400 course for sure. So yeah, this is the 50,000 foot view. For some of you, this is the no-duh kind of overview that you're not looking for. So I apologize for that. But I think it's important for all of us to at least appreciate and have the same level of understanding of the fate of our wastes. Next. In 2018, according to EPA, there was 292 million tons of waste disposed in the United States. Nearly twice what it was in the 1960s. Currently, the national recycling rate in New Hampshire dances around this area too, around 35%. It's difficult because the recycling rates are calculated in different ways. Different states calculate rates differently. There are some eastern states that include chum in their recycling rates, so it can be very confusing. And others include demanufacturing of ships, U.S. naval ships, and into their recycling rates. So when comparing ourselves to others, please take caution. Even our immediate neighbors calculate recycling rates very differently, and what is considered waste. So it's not only the numerator, but it can also be the denominator that impacts that recycling rate. So with caution. In 1960, our recycling rate was around 3%. And interestingly, the World Bank estimates that high-income countries, the United States is one of those, will increase waste disposal needs by 19% by 2050. So waste is being projected to increase, not decrease. What has changed? We all talk a lot about this in the industry, about the evolving ton. But the items that we throw away has changed. Single-use disposable has changed. I would lump into that single-use recyclable, so just single-use in general. I mean, bottled water is a big thing. So that's just an example of single-use items that we now consume that 20 years ago we never did. Where we generate waste has changed as well. There used to be stay-at-home moms. There used to be home industry. Now we spend most of our time away from home. So in many cases we don't have access to recycling options or waste diversion options. Or we're doing all sorts of single-use consumables because we're away from home. And this has a huge impact on recycling and access to recycling, obviously. And then how we dispose of waste has changed. Not only single-stream recycling, but back in the late 80s and 90s, in New Hampshire anyways, a lot of online landfills were being closed and capped. So your local landfill in the town of Nottingham no longer exists. Now your waste is being trucked much further than just around the corner. Or something I was thinking about, actually a couple weekends ago, I had an opportunity to go to Keene. I went to Keene and worked with Duncan, and as I was driving out of town, I was remembering the Keene landfill is located, you actually have to go into a neighboring town to get into it. Very often landfills are placed just as far away from us as we can get them. City of Lebanon's landfill, if you go any further south, you're in Plainfield, and over again, we have done everything we can to get our waste away from us. So culturally, that's just the way that it works and functions. And we need to change the way we're looking at our waste as far as just, the whole not in my backyard concept and philosophy is alive and well today. Next. So what we throw away has changed. The biggest thing for me is the plastics piece of the pie. When I was the recycling coordinator in New Hampshire, that was down around 5 or 6. Now it's up around 12 to 15%, and projections for that plastic piece of the pie is anticipated to grow. Again, because of single-use products, recyclables and disposables. So that will grow. Paper seems to be leveling off, but it did drop because of internet. People aren't buying newspapers and other publications. It's all online. So paper production has gone down a bit, but it's not plummeting like we thought. The biggest thing in my mind that we talk very little about is the toxicity of the waste stream. Online landfills, forgive me, please take this into context, weren't as big a deal as they are today. The toxicity of the waste stream decades ago was certainly not what it is today. We all get a new cell phone every 18 to 24 months, and unfortunately very often those cell phones end up in disposal facilities. Batteries, last night I was in the grocery store watching this young man walk with blinking shoes. So those shoes have batteries. Where will those shoes end up? They will end up in the garbage. So the toxicity of our waste stream is not only items we use regularly and are part of being a productive person in society, but silly things like blinking shoes. And PFAS, or what's next? The list continues to grow. I mean, it was lead and mercury and PCBs, and now it's PFAS. What's next? So that only gets nastier. How we dispose of our waste, I think we all pretty much have a grasp on this. And this is national information, but in New Hampshire, it's certainly not. The waste combustion is probably around 10%, 10 to 12. And I'm sure you have a better handle on that, but this is just to have a broad understanding. Majority of our waste is landfilled. That's the point. About about a third of it is recovered through recycling and composting activities. Again, it's confusing when you compare yourself to EPA, because last year EPA started incorporating food diversion, so not composting, but food banks and other food diversion opportunities, food for animals and food for people, and so that number wasn't included before. So there's this strange spike, and it's not because we're doing better; it's because we've added something to the number. So it's important to understand that. Next. So to finally get to what Karen asked me to do, what is a landfill? So landfilling is the least preferred but most used. And I think we could talk for hours just about that concept alone. And why is that the case? I think we all have different ideas about why that's the case. In New Hampshire, it's a double liner system. In other states, it's a single liner system. So each state is different. Very often people will wonder, why is it less expensive over there? And why is it less expensive in the Midwest? Groundwater is not very deep in some places in the Northeast. There's also a lot of bedrock, so it creates technological, engineering, construction challenges to physically build a landfill, whereas in other parts of the country, it's a whole lot easier to dig a big hole. So there's that piece of it. Leachate collection, that is basically, it rains and passes through waste, and that goo, soup, nasty that's in the bottom is collected and makes its way to typically a POTW, wastewater treatment facility, and then is treated and discharged. There's a cost to that. The whole PFAS equation comes up into this discussion now. There's a lot of other conversations now that we're looking very deeply into this. So it's costly, it's nasty, so it's part of landfilling. Something I was thinking about with this too, as I was preparing this presentation, is very often I hear statements like, "Oh, we're just going to bury it." I'll tell you what, this is not burying. Over the years, what I've come up with is this is undigging. Where Lebanon landfill is located, right across the street is a Old Castle Pike quarry, and they're digging. And the way they dig is just the same way we fill. So it's like this undigging process where they create lifts, and we're doing the exact same thing. We're building a mountain, not burying something. In my mind, burying implies a hole that everything goes in and then just gets covered. It is so much more complicated than that. That it's, in my mind, it's not burying, which leads me to fill sequencing. As far as how do you properly place waste to maximize this invisible volume. Sometimes there's a hole that gets created, or it's in the side of a hill and it's propped up over somewhere else, and how do you place waste in that to best manage a variety of issues? You open a new cell, you don't put C&D down first. You've got to put fluffy waste down first to protect the liner. And what do you do with that C&D waste until you've achieved a depth of waste in that? You can't always run equipment over it at that time. So it's a change in operation when you open a new cell. So it's not simply, we all have these memories of Saturday going to the dump with Dad, and there's some old guy in a shack who every once in a while goes out, either sets it on fire or pushes it over with a loader. Those days are well past gone. So fill sequencing is a complicated thing. Just this week we received what I call our capacity plan from Sanborn Head. Shows us our cut fills. I get with staff and we talk about, here's what we're doing for the next 12 months. Here's where we're going. Here's our cuts, here's our fills. Cover material. When we think about landfills, we think about everything we're throwing in there. But the permit that we have in Lebanon requires us to place 6 inches of cover over the trash every day. Cover includes native soils, which are clean soils, or the equivalent. For us, we can use demolition chips that we get from, and he's not here today, from Reenergy or Resource. So as a byproduct of their recycling process, we get a chipped demo product, we mix with clean soils, and that's our cover product. This year we're going to reinstitute a tarping system where we avoid adding that 6 inches, but within a landfill it's not just garbage we don't want, but there's also clean soil that is placed over trash. And then on outside slopes we have to use a topsoil or equivalent to produce a vegetative layer to reduce erosion. And all of these things have reason. The reason I discovered the 6 inches was EPA did a study on how fast a maggot can move through soil in 24 hours. And a maggot will move through 4 inches of soil in 24 hours. My question was, if a maggot is in the garbage, why is it going to go through any amount of soil? It's in its food source. But anyway, so they figured, just like a lot of other things, if 4 inches is good, 6 inches are better. So that's where 6 inches arrives at. So that's cover material. There's a whole host of other opportunities like sprays. There's, it's almost like a very liquidy concrete that can be applied to help preserve capacity that a lot of landfills are using to preserve that capacity. There's gas collection and leachate recirculation. Again, it's another piece of managing a landfill that just adds to the complexity. Right now we're opening a new cell within our landfill, which requires us to look at our gas map and figure out, okay, where are those pipes? How far down can we dig? Or where are they located? So it adds a layer of complexity. Again, showing that this is not simply burying trash. And then closure. We don't talk about this, is that eventually these all fill up. And then there's a whole process for closing these landfills. And to Duncan's point about, you fossilize. I think within the general public, and I feel confident in saying this because I've heard it from the general public, there's this view that it'll decompose. And for anybody who's managed a landfill, and this morning as I was driving in here, I felt like I'm like at an AA meeting or something. I said, hi, my name is Mark Morgan, I operate a landfill. In this circle it's not so bad, but in other circles it's unfriendly. So it's an amusing conundrum. But anyway, eventually they fill up, and what do we do with those? You can mine them, but there's still something left that you've got to put someplace. And very often it's, well, why did you do this or why did you do that? Well, we received it. Now we're doing the best we can to manage this waste. So it can be very tricky. Next. This is a picture of a modern landfill. This is a very basic schematic where you've got groundwater monitoring wells. And I've had people ask, well, how do you know when the liner is failing? Right there, groundwater monitoring wells that are right next to your liner to indicate what's going on. And those are checked quarterly to make sure that the liners are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Waste is placed inside. There's a leachate collection system. There it is, just a very basic thing. Next. So a little bit about Lebanon. We serve 22 communities. Full disclosure, 30% of our waste is out of state. Geopolitically in the Upper Valley, it's the Upper Valley. White River Junction, Lebanon is forever has been the Upper Valley. And those state lines lead in a variety of directions. But 30% of our waste is from our neighboring communities in Vermont, right across the river. We serve about 80,000 people. The 22 communities sounds impressive, but we have towns of like 250 people. So it's a huge area geographically, but not a lot of people. We manage about 35,000 tons a year of MSW. That fluctuates as with everybody else. I think I determined one area that turnkey landfill actually settles more than Lebanon landfills in a year. So I thought that was interesting. So maybe we're a net zero landfill if we look at it like that.
We can talk later, Mark.
We'll have to pay for that credit, right? We do compost at our facility. We just in the last month received our food scrap compost permit. We have been composting for about 15 years. We've fiddled with the rules a little bit and literally composted on the landfill. So technically the waste was still going in the landfill, but it was composted on and used on side slopes, so it never actually left the footprint. We recycle about 2,000 tons of source separated recyclables. Again, our communities have access to our facility. We have a recycling app. Little Lebanon has a recycling app that's connected to our program. It's not just what's recyclable in the universe, but we work with a vendor called Better Bin. You can, through the app, you scan the UPC code on a particular product. It tells you if it's recyclable in Lebanon or not. If there's confusion, the user actually sends that information to the vendor. We update our information, answer questions, and we have about 500 households that participate in our app program. So it's one more opportunity for outreach. Some of the other 15,000 tons of material is clean, dirty, demo chip stuff. We have emptied and filled our gravel pit 3 times in the last 10 years. There's so much development in the Upper Valley. They're looking for disposal sites for clean soil. And the soils in the Upper Valley are poorly compacted. So when you're putting in a parking garage, a couple of years ago we took 100,000 yards of clean sand out of Hanover to install a parking garage. That was just beautiful material, not a rock in it, but it's clean soil. So back to that point about cover materials, landfills are resource intensive. I figure we're consuming about, I think it's a gallon of diesel per ton, I think is what we're consuming a day or whatever it is. So we use a lot of diesel fuel. You know, some of these they're not fuel efficient vehicles because they have a very difficult job to do. They're running over over trash, shredding. It's a resource intensive process. We currently have permitted capacity for another 9 years. We're planning for 75 because we're going to excavate an unlined landfill. We're going to employ mechanically stabilized earth berms and do a variety of other engineering things to extend that disposal capacity. Next. This is the Lebanon landfill, and yes, we're right on the Connecticut River. So the Shoreline Protection Act does apply to us. A lot of people I've heard people say, what a horrible place to locate a landfill. Again, I go back to my point earlier. Keens landfill was sited in a swamp probably in the 1940s. So was Lebanon. Lebanon, I looked at some aerial photographs through the NRDC, and you can see landfill activity as far back as the 1940s. These places were not located because they were the best locations for landfills. It was the furthest place away from the community. If you go to Lebanon and you drive down 12A, which is the road that leads up there, wow, what a populated area. 20 years ago, those stores were not there. So through the years, development has crept in closer. So when this was sited, it was a dirt track, a rat shooting arena, and a landfill. Next. So some of my thoughts as it relates to landfill and disposal. Landfill is the least preferred, but is the most used disposal option. No matter how we frame this whole thing, at some point, something's going to require landfill. There's a class I teach at Dartmouth, and one of the concepts we talk about is circular recycling options and linear recycling options. There are recycling options that are linear, which means that you're using a product to make something else that will eventually end up in the landfill anyway. I'm not suggesting that you don't recycle it. I'm just saying that that's part of, some of our recycling options, that eventually we're going to need disposal options. The waste industry has changed, as we talked about. Labor issues are a big deal. Global markets are a big deal. International regulations, there's one out now that is being talked about where they're going to characterize plastic as a hazardous waste. Right. That changes the way we move plastic recyclables overseas, even if they're going for recycling. It has an impact. The equipment we're using, the waste stream, and lots of new regulations are happening. Solutions we come up with for today's problems will need to consider future possibilities. You know, when we're developing things, we shouldn't just be focusing on how can we extend landfills, how can we better landfill, but maybe looking at some other opportunities for how can we develop things so it didn't go there in the first place, using some other preferred alternatives. We've got artificial intelligence and robotics being used in sort facilities. What a crazy concept 10 years ago. Right now it's a huge market because of labor shortages. So now we've got robots pulling a 2x4 out of a C&D sort line. Waste conversion technologies, as was discussed earlier, and then that ever-changing waste stream. There are techniques that we're using today in landfilling that we never used before. I know that the trash compactor we use in Lebanon, we bought from Finland. It's a very different machine than we used years ago. I can actually access it through a smartphone and see the engine temperature from here. But it's also much heavier. It's designed differently than it was years ago. Years ago, it was the biggest loader with steel wheels was a trash compactor. Doing things like textured liner for inside slopes to allow us to have steeper slopes now that you don't even see to add capacity. There are a lot of techniques that we've employed, you know, in the last several decades that have changed the way we landfill and increased disposal capacity. The other thing is, I was thinking about this too, is, you know, today's Earth Day, and Earth Day was established to, you know, help clean things up. As awful and as frustrating as we feel at times regarding landfills, and I'm not promoting landfills by saying this, it's a whole lot better than it was 50 years ago with unlined landfills. We have so many more regulations, so many more monitoring wells around facilities. The technology that's used in our liner systems continues to improve. The techniques for placing waste is improving. It's an ever evolving and changing. Again, please don't take that out of context in that I'm promoting landfilling. I'm just suggesting that it is much better today than it was yesteryear. Next. Questions? So, once upon a time, people used to dump here all their waste. So, happy to answer any questions, or, you know, like I said, I've learned a lot from the people in this room, and happy to answer anything anybody might have.
I have one question that for the audience. You mentioned the old landfills, the closed landfills that are unlined. Are those being monitored and maintained?
Some yes, some no. There are some communities who, because of years and boards of selectmen have come and gone, and the town fathers have come and gone, it's amusing. You could go to a town anywhere and ask, where's the old dump? And somebody will tell you, and you go there and there's trees growing up through it, and there's a tractor in there, and there's a whole host of things. And is it on the map at DES? So years ago I used to work at DES, and I had a service area on the seacoast. When I determined what towns I wanted to go to, we provided technical assistance, not regulatory oversight. So the group I worked for was a planning group. When I determined the towns I went to, I would go and find the towns that did not have a licensed transfer station, then go to that town and ask, where's the transfer station? 9 times out of 10 they told me, but it wasn't a permitted facility. Sometimes it was literally on the dump road. There's a few of those, and it was improper disposal. So it's, you know, we talk about yesteryear, but there are communities that in the last decade were doing the wrong thing regularly. So they're out there. There are some who are being regulated to the hilt, and then there are others that are just, they don't even know it. I'm not saying that they're being, you know, wrong or doing something awful. They're not even aware of it. Not even aware of it.
Well, culturally, there's still burn barrels galore out there.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. I mean, I have customers come in and, you know, we're a pay-as-you-throw community, and they get angry and go, well, I'm just going to go burn this. What? I mean, even today, that's just it's too expensive. I'm just going to burn it. That just seems like such an archaic response to proper
interesting comment you mentioned about the site being near a river. 30 years ago, our company bought a facility in Connecticut, and it had a permitted footprint. And we went in to build an Excel and gave them plans, and we had a liner there. And the state, when it was DEP, they're called something a little different now. They didn't approve our plans because it had a liner. And this is 30 years ago. They did not want to landfill the liner because they were concerned about generating leachate and then where that would go, and they didn't want the wastewater plants to have to deal with it. So the site was near a river for a reason. All the sites at the time that were being cited in Connecticut were near rivers because they knew where the groundwater was going, and they didn't want a liner because that's where dilution was going to take place. And they said, if you want to continue to operate here, you can't put a liner in place. And we went on for 2.5 years. We finally gave up and built it without a liner. Put down clay, but we couldn't put down a HDPE liner on top of the clay, which is what we were trying to do at the time.
So the value of being next to a river is you know the flow of groundwater. So it's easier to monitor, so EPA requires upstream and downstream monitoring wells, so knowing the flow of your groundwater, it makes it much easier to monitor, with your leak detection and understand what's going on underground. I'm not suggesting we cite all of our landfills as rivers, I'm just saying that from a monitoring standpoint, it's easier.
So, Mark, there was one thing, so if there's a tear in the liner and it's way at the bottom, and you discovered that through your monitoring wells, how is that repaired? I mean, how do you get to it to repair it or
You'd
to
have
stop
dig it
the
up.
leak?
I mean, we've done some projects where we had to dig in to do some installations. On our site, we have these monitoring wells that go all the way down to the liner, and there's a regulation that says that you can't have leachate any more than 18 inches on the liner. So how do you track that? Well, you have a standpipe that goes all the way down to the liner, and you check to make sure there isn't 18 inches. Well, ours showed 36 inches, but our flows weren't changing. So we continued to monitor. Then we had to excavate this massive portion of the landfill. And what happened was that standpipe plugged. So it was completely dry all the way around, 30 feet down into the waste mass. And then when we pulled the standpipe up, all this water just gushed out of the standpipe and it just plugged. So
I think we need to give the maggots the right tools and have them go down versus go up.
Right, absolutely, and eat heartily.
Aren't there lifespans of the liners? So how do you rectify that situation?
No different than anything else. I mean, you continue to monitor. Like I said about the fill sequencing, there are techniques to help preserve it and maintain it and keep the leachate off of it, keep it as dry as possible. And
I was going to say, when we're building the liner systems, there's a lot of what we call construction quality assurance to make sure that there's none, but and there's some testing you can do to see if there's any leakage. As Mark said, those components are covered with that soft place so that you're not going to have a tear. So getting a tear after construction is pretty unlikely. Usually your groundwater impacts are from something else, like there's a spill outside the lined area or other things. But we don't typically find a tear,
Does
15
it
years.
deteriorate?
They're high density polyethylene products, so it's not just your garbage bags. It's a different formulation. And EPA used to require testing for that, which had showed over 100-year lifespans on those materials. So all the plastics that are in there are that quality. So they're very, very long lasting. And the idea is that after you stop filling, that your waste is going to degrade to become near inert. So there's like this balance between the toxicity of the waste versus the long-term performance of the components.
Well, that was one of the. That was one of the things I wanted to get at with Mark's presentation. presentation is that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how much decomposition actually goes on in a landfill, and there's really one of our famous stories. Mark and Mike and I were on NHPR, and and we were talking about solid waste, and this lovely child from a 6th grade class somewhere calls and says, "How long does it take for I don't know, paper or something to decompose?" And I said, we looked at Mark, and he basically sat up. He says, "There's no decomposition in a landfill," and I think the kid was crushed. But anyway.
Well, like when we
I
did
think
that
it's really an
excavation,
important point.
you know, we found a book that was still a book. It was dry. You could open it and read the pages. So a book, you know, is paper. You would presume after 30 years in the ground that it would decompose, but no, it was not decomposing. So. You had a question?
Mark, I was interested in your mentioning that there's consideration of international regulations on treating plastics as hazardous. Is that because of stabilizers, colorants, components?
It's a
PFAS?
variety of. I mean, it started years ago.
Yeah.
So it's a variety of issues, and I'll find out what it's attached to, and I'll send that to you. But it is an international regulation.
Mark, it's called the Basel Convention.
Oh, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's the Basel Convention, which in the past had addressed electronics wastes.
Yeah.
You know, kind of this overarching toxicity of the waste stream. So it's just interesting how that's being characterized.
Yeah.
That there are, all of our portions of the waste stream have hazardous components. But one thing I do want to make sure that people understand is we all of us contribute to this in some fashion or another. If you're buying a product, there's waste generated from the production of that product in wherever it was produced. So we're all participating in this. We all have a role in this, and we all have skin in the game. And you know, I think one of the things that this group has in front of it is that challenge. Is, you know, and I put in one of them was, instead of looking at better landfilling and how do we continue to do what we're doing better, is not the solution. The solution is those preferred alternatives, you know, outside of the landfill, getting it back out into you know, some sort of resource stream is really what we should be looking at. So.
I know it was inadvertent, but I've always thought the placement of the Lebanon landfill.
I'm sorry, John, you're not on the working group, so
Okay,
we're
that's
just
fine.
trying to limit the, so go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to speak to a question you had about the life of the liner system. It hasn't been around for 300 years, but the work that EPA and others have done is it approaches 300 years from what they can project that will last. And that's, you know, 100 to 300 is a good number. But what's interesting is, I'm hearing the conversation, we're talking about how stuff doesn't degrade and how plastics are around for 1,000 years. 1,000 years for the plastics in the landfill is a real problem. You know, the liner that's made to a certain quality spec, you know, is only going to last 100 to 300 years. Generally, it's going to last as long as the plastic that's been disposed of in the landfill. I agree with Mark that in many areas of the landfill, stuff does not degrade once it's cut off from water. In areas where water is getting in, that decomposition happens pretty quickly. But if it's dry, and some of these sites get filled pretty quickly and get capped to keep them dry, that decomposition doesn't happen that significantly. But to your point on the landfill generation, we have a site at Turnkey. It's called TLR2, but it's a double line facility, and so we're monitoring the leachate collection of the first liner and the second liner, and it's been capped, and the leachate production, you know, is on the order of 250 to 300 gallons per acre per day when it's operating. Once it's closed, it's about 3 to 6 gallons per acre per day on the first liner, and on the second liner, it's like 10% of that. So those are mechanisms we use to gauge whether that liner system's performing or not, having those two liner systems.
So the other thing, I didn't mention this and Steve made me think of it, is we're talking about this liner system with this vision of a sheet of plastic, whatever thickness it might be. A liner system is a considerable mass.
Feet thick.
You know, it's feet thick. So it's plastic, sometimes it's geocomposites that mimic drainage material, or it's a geosynthetic clay product to mimic clay, a foot of clay. So it's a fairly complicated system. So it's not just dig a hole, put it in a plastic sheet, and away we go. It's a more complicated liner system than people realize.
So just, I'm looking at the time, but I just want to get back at the leachate, as I understand it, is basically because of rain passing in, and maybe to a much more limited extent from some decomposition. Is that right?
Precipitation, yes. Yeah.
Snow
Right.
melt and rain.
Although a lot of waste does come in wet, so there is field content of water too, but yeah, absolutely, the hydrologic cycle. Snow
Well,
melt,
and then
rain.
where does the methane come from, or where do the landfill gases come from if it's not decomposition?
That's
Bug burps and farts.
Huh?
Yeah,
Bug burps and farts.
the organic material in the landfill is what generates the landfill gas. Once the landfill is capped and it becomes dry tomb, if you want to call it that gas production drops off. We have again, a turnkey, that same PLR2 site has originally had, at the time it was operating, gas generation of about 2,000 cubic feet per minute. It's now down to 180 cubic feet per minute because it's so dry, it's not decomposing, and it's not generating gas. We had looked at actually opening that back up, introducing leachate to try to stop that process over again and generate more gas, but we abandoned that idea. I think we got a permit, a demonstration. We talked about it years ago. I don't know if you were there or not, but so once it's dry, it really slows down the decomposition process.
Well, and of course, and the way I think of it, you're trying to really secure that because there's so much foul stuff in the landfill. You don't want it. I mean, you just gotta fossilize it. So, okay. Well, thank you, Mark. I thought it would be helpful just for the group to really focus in on landfills and understand really why they are at the bottom of our hierarchy, and there's a lot of reasons, and gives us extra oomph to achieve our goals. So, Howard, we haven't left you too much time. I don't know if you want to just do a really quick legislative recap.
Sure, and I'll give kudos to Reagan, put together a really good report that she sent to you honestly, and kind of covers where everything is. The only thing I will really update, I guess, is House Bill 1049 is scheduled for a hearing next Tuesday, or 4/26. I think that's next Tuesday at 9:10. And so that is not on her update, but honestly, just read through her update that she sent you. She's done a really good job in capping where everything is. Let's see, we had Senate Bill, I got them all laid out here. Senate Bill 368 and is in work session. That's the wrong one. 367. All these back-to-back numbers. That's the advanced recycling and manufacturing bill that we still have, and the committee is still working on that. We've got one more scheduled work session next Tuesday, and then we have to exec it out of committee because it has to go to the House floor because of deadlines. So we will be getting that bill out of committee yet. I'm not going to tell you where it's going because I'm not 100% sure, but the committee is diligently working on it and really put in a lot of time the subcommittee has on it.
Complicated.
It is, and one of the things we focused on in our subcommittee group discussion, because it looks at new technologies and the regulations that might be needed for Mike and his team here at DS to do their job in the event that there was a failure. So that is still an ongoing bill, and we'll see how it comes out. Beyond that, I don't think there's too much more to update beyond what her report is. So thank you. You made my job easy. Any questions? All right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. This is great. I hope that Director Limsat likes these. we wanna support the department, and it just shows what a complex job, you guys have coming up with the solid waste plan and everything, so.
No, I think this was really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything you wanna add, or?
No, I don't think so. I just think I want to augment a little bit what Steve said. I think at some point some people just decided that, well, nothing ever happens in a landfill, nothing degrades. Steve wouldn't be sending, I don't know how many million cubic feet of gas to UNH if nothing in a landfill degraded. So it does degrade, as Steve said, when you get moisture to it and in the right conditions, there's significant decomposition, and that's what creates a gas project that either produces power or heat or whatever it might be.
And that's the organics.
Right, absolutely, right. But again, you know, even the book that Mark mentioned, in the right conditions, that's an organic, that will degrade. In the particular example he had, it probably never saw any moisture, so it didn't degrade. But I just don't want people to think that every landfill is just whatever you put in there is going to be there forever, because a lot of it, you're not going to want to see it again.
Would you just for the group, talk about the EPA funding opportunity that came out of the infrastructure, just so they know?
Sure, yeah, we're still waiting to hear what that's going to look like. And again, we had the EBC, Northern New England conference a couple weeks back, where Chris Beeling from EPA spoke about the funding options that are available. The bipartisan infrastructure law has set aside some significant funding over the next 5 years to put towards solid waste, which is really, I mean, it's kind of groundbreaking, because there's been little to no money put out for grants to states or others for solid waste issues over the history of EPA. And we anticipate that states and other parties, but certainly states, will have access to grant funding that will largely be targeted towards them then making grants to to parties who are going to advance various recycling and waste diversion technologies. So we're very excited about that, because as many here have heard me say, New Hampshire DES has never had access to any funding to make those kind of grants. And so whatever amount we might see, and we don't know what it's going to look like yet, we would be really excited to be able to make grants to advance, whether it's composting or help site a MRF or anaerobic digester, whatever it might be. So we're really excited about that, and we think that we're going to see some notices and some opportunities to apply for that money, such that we might actually even see the money. I don't think it'll happen. They're saying it could be late fall of this year, but more likely early in 2023. So that's really exciting, and we're anxious to see what that's going to look like.
So then you basically look at the guidelines and decide what sorts of grants you might like to apply for?
Yeah, there will be, as with all EPA funding, there will be strictures on how it can be used, and we'll have to comply with those. But whatever it is they make money available for, we would go after that money, and if we get a grant, it would be administered by EPA as a grant to the state, and then we would turn around and advertise, probably would have to be, it won't be an unlimited amount of money, so some kind of competitive grant, and we hope it'll be available to municipalities. Certainly, I think that will be a target, but also to the private sector to try to, that's more of a question. EPA gets really kind of hinky about that. They don't usually comfortable with that, so I don't know who the eligible parties will be. At the very least, it will be probably municipalities and regional planning commissions and that sort of thing, quasi-public entities who want to, it could be something as simple as we just want to, spend a little money to upgrade our infrastructure at a transfer station so that we can do composting on site. Or, it could be something simple as a baler or something like that. But hopefully, more substantial amounts of money that might be available to incentivize regional or large-scale local projects that would really advance alternate technologies to help divert waste that aren't currently being diverted from landfill disposal. We'll know more when they tell us what they're going to do.
Well, in SB 379, which created the Solid Waste Management Fund, it has 4 steps basically. It went through both steps in the Senate, passed the House, and next it's going to Ways and Means. But that fund, or the empty vessel as I've called it, is the vehicle where some of this federal funding can go for use by the state, as well as any other funding we might generate within the state along the way. So that has to go through Ways and Means in the House, and then if all that goes well, then it would go to the governor. But so far, it's basically been consent calendar material, so, that's
Yeah, there's no-
encouraging.
There's no money in it, so
No,
we were able to
that
put
makes
it on
less
consent.
challenging. That's the empty vessel part.
Yes.
Okay, all right, well, thanks so much, everybody. Is there anything any other member wants to share? No? So, go ahead,
Just a
Steve.
quick question, subcommittees reported out, we're gonna meet again next month. What do you want for work product?
You typed your minutes, right? I don't know, is yours hand?
It's a combination of both.
I mean, I think it would be great if you could feed it into Mike North, the
It's the same use.
whatever minutes.
Can they be bullet points and not nice
Yeah.
sentences and
Yeah, but
paragraphs?
at least
like
it's,
that?
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
No
it would
typos.
jog our
Just
memory.
basically any record that you
Sure.
created
Yeah.
would be helpful, and then we'll put that up on the website.
Yeah.
I sent
Yep.
it your way, Mike.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. So we'll see you in a month-ish. What did you say, the 27th? Well, we'll send out a notice.
Yeah, I think so.
It's the 27th.
Yeah, and then, so we're gonna start now at 9, make it 9 to 12 or whatever. Okay? All right,